Chapter 589. Being a father for the first time, and finding the long-lost gentleness on his wife's knees, Fan Xian slept peacefully. He didn't wake until late in the morning. In the moment he woke, there was still a satisfied smile at the corners of his lips. Opening his eyes, he found that Won'er was no longer by his side. He guessed that she had gone to see her daughter. He couldn't help but rub his head and smile. He thought that now that he was also a father, when he did things and thought about problems, he had to be more appropriate and steady. Thinking like this, he threw the death disputes in Jingdo to the back of his mind. His mood, which had been gloomy for a long time, became a bit more cheerful. However, the sky was bright and urged him to return to the dangerous world. Fan Xian sighed and casually washed up with the help of a serving girl. He put on his official robes and entered the flower hall. He didn't want to eat properly. Carrying a bowl of bird's nest porridge, he entered the east wing and looked at his still sleeping daughter. As he ate, he joked with Won'er and Cici. He then went to pay his respects to his father, Lady Lu, and left the manor for the royal palace. The streets of Jingdo were still filled with a somber atmosphere. However, the emperor had returned safely to the capital. The Jingdo people's moods were much more at ease. The number of people on the streets gradually increased. Fan Xian looked at this scene through the window and felt slightly at ease. Passing through the palace doors and along the long corridor, he came to the royal study. As expected, he saw the diligent emperor wearing an unlined robe and reading memorials. Fan Xian was slightly surprised. After bowing, he stood up and waited silently to the side, using his peripheral vision to sneak a look at the emperor's expression. With a glance, he was shocked. He found that the corners of the emperor's lips carried an unfathomable smile. Naturally, it revealed a sense of comfort. It was completely different from the lonely appearance of the father and son of the Tian family yesterday, after they had killed each other. Fan Xian was confused. He thought to himself that he had just given birth to a precious daughter. So he was happy. Where did the emperor's happiness come from? Thinking of this, Fan Xian felt even more admiration for Director Chun, who had been summoned into the palace last night. Probably only that old cripple could make the emperor so happy. It was as if he had forgotten the tragedies that had happened one after another. The emperor put down the memorial and raised his head. Looking at Fan Xian warmly, he said, "There is no court conference today. Why have you come to the palace so early?" Jingdo had just stabilized. The officials of the 6 ministries were either locked up, escaped, injured, or dead. Everything was still under the control of the military. With the imperial army as the main force, and the Jingdo government as the base, they maintained the general order of Jingdo. Naturally, there was no way to hold a court conference as usual. Fan Xian felt it was strange. He thought to himself that the situation was so tense. Who knew how many things had to be taken care of in the palace? Even if the emperor wanted to immediately strip him of his position as the regent, as a close official, he had to enter the palace to share the burdens. Did he dare to close his door and live out his days in his manor? He carefully replied, "The rebel army is about to be ambushed, but there are still some uncertainties in various places. I thought about it carefully and was afraid that His Majesty would have some instructions, so I hurried to enter the palace." The emperor smiled and said, "You just gave birth to a girl, yet you don't stay a bit longer in the manor. Could it be that you really have a busy life?" Fan Xian smiled. He knew that it must have been Chen Piping, who had spoken to the emperor last night. He said, "After I'm off duty, I'll just go back to the manor and hug more." "You're not an official of the Hall of Governmental Affairs. When did I put you on duty?" The emperor glared at him and said, "You still have to be so careless after giving birth. How is that like a father?" Fan Xian paused. Only now did he understand the emperor's meaning. It looked like he was preparing for him to go home and nurse his child. This was what he had hoped for. Hearing the emperor's harsh words of criticism, he felt a bit depressed in his heart. When it came to being a father, although it was his first time, he thought he would be much better than the emperor. Didn't he see what happened to Chengqian and the second prince? Thinking of the 2 brothers, he immediately thought of Chengqian, waiting for death in the Eastern Palace, while he had just given birth to a daughter. The expression on his face began to become strange. His lips moved slightly, He didn't know how to respond to the emperor's words. Perhaps the emperor saw something strange in his expression. His expression also changed slightly, but he did not give any instructions on how to deal with the matter of the rebellion. Lightly he said, "You don't have to wait in the palace today. Go back first. It's your first day as a father. You have to be careful." Pausing slightly, the emperor suddenly tilted his head as if thinking about something. A moment later he slowly said, "Tomorrow, have Chen girl bring the child into the palace for me to see." Fan Xian quickly gave his thanks. He could also see that the emperor's mood had become bad again. Receiving the edict, he quickly left the royal study. As soon as he left the royal study, he was stopped by eunuch Yao. He had probably also received news of the Fan Manor's happiness, and repeatedly offered his congratulations. Fan Xian didn't have time to chat much with the eunuch. He handed over a red packet but suddenly thought of something. Lowering his voice, he asked about the captured eunuchs and serving girls in the palace, as well as the aces and guards of the internal court, about how to deal with them. Although the true settling of accounts after autumn should be a matter after the situation was settled, dealing with things in the palace was always much faster than dealing with things outside. Even if they hadn't taken action yet, the emperor should have drawn up some rules. Fan Xian was worried. Taking advantage of this opportunity, he asked the eunuch close to the emperor. Although he was worried in his heart, his face did not show a glimmer of anxiety. He did his best to ask as lightly as possible, pretending to be concerned as a regent should. Eunuch Yao knew this young man's identity and knew his future power. He would not think too much, and picked out a few important matters to talk about. Fan Xian had wanted to ask about the situation in the Eastern Palace. After thinking about it carefully, he closed his mouth. After bidding farewell to eunuch Yao, he was in a daze and couldn't come back to his senses for a moment. What shocked him was that the emperor had dealt with these eunuchs, serving girls, and guards so leniently. It was completely different from what he had guessed. Putting aside Hong Zhu, the head of the eunuchs who hadn't done anything on the surface, not many of the nannies in Hongguang Palace, the new eunuchs in the Eastern Palace, and the serving girls in Guangxin Palace had been killed. Most of them had kept their lives. Fan Xian shook his head and walked toward the outside of the palace. He wondered if the sun had risen from the west today. How did the emperor suddenly become such a gentle person? Suddenly his heart jumped. Thinking of the emperor's dark expression last night and his warm conversation with him earlier, he involuntarily guessed that perhaps the emperor had finally thought through some things after suffering a great shock, and was beginning to accumulate good fortune for himself and the descendants of the Li family. The reality was actually not far from his guess. The emperor was not someone who killed indiscriminately or liked to kill. It was just that his personality was firm and harsh, and he did not shy away from killing. For example, the servants in the palace only listened to the Empress Dowager's orders, and were not deeply involved in rebellion. Furthermore, the emperor did not care about removing weeds by the roots. Additionally, the crown prince and second prince had used their deaths to show their resistance. This made a slight change in the emperor's mentality. The next day, Fan Xian and Lin Wanner carried the little girl into the palace. For the first time, the emperor displayed the benevolence an elder should have in front of the two of them. He held the baby girl and looked closely at her for a long time. He was in a good mood. However, when the emperor used his fingers to carefully stroke the baby girl's brows, Fan Xian's heart trembled. In Hongguang Palace, he knew how powerful the emperor's fingers were. However, the emperor seemed to like this girl very much, particularly her brows and eyes. Fan Xian looked at this scene and muttered to himself. He wondered if the emperor was beginning to remember some of the marks from the past again. As he was thinking this, the emperor had him take the child to the various palaces for the concubines to see, and left Wanner behind. Fan Xian was slightly surprised but didn't say anything. He followed the order and left. Presently, there was no mistress in the palace. Naturally, the reward for sending off the child could not be immediately explained. It was left to be dealt with in the future. When Lady Ning carried the child, she said she wanted the palace to send a nanny and wet nurse. However, Fan Xian firmly refused. This made Lady Ning and Yi Guipen a bit puzzled. This was supposed to be a joyous occasion, But too many people had died in the palace recently, so it was impossible to be happy. No matter how loud Lady Ning's laughter was, it could not dilute the strange atmosphere in the palace. Iguipin only smiled warmly. It was the third prince, Li Qingping, who had not yet recovered from his injuries, who struggled to be carried, and called her little sister. The corners of Fan Xian's lips twitched slightly. He thought to himself that this kid was indeed terrifyingly precocious. However, this seniority seemed to be ridiculously wrong. For some reason, he thought of his sister in Xia far away in northern Qi. The Dong Mountain matter involved 3 countries. He was certain to die. He didn't know if the 2 of them would have any problems over there. He didn't stay for long before Fan Xian withdrew with the child in his arms. He went into the royal study to pick up his wife and bid farewell to the emperor to return home. The emperor thought for a moment and then allowed it. He also said that the matter of bestowing names could be discussed later. Fan Xian knew that the emperor had been busy dealing with court affairs after the rebellion. He had not thought that he would still remember such a small matter. He couldn't help but be surprised. After leaving the palace, Fan Xian didn't ask Wanner what the emperor had kept her to say. Looking at his wife's red and swollen eyes, he knew that the conversation between his uncle and niece this time was, without a doubt, related to the deaths of the eldest princess, and those 2. In the following month, under the emperor's powerful efforts, the 6 ministries, 3 departments, and 3 departments of the court gradually returned to the right track. The remnants of the rebel army scattered in the wilderness were also completely wiped out. Yi Zhong led the troops back in triumph. The entire situation had stabilized. Jingdo returned to peace. The aura of the rebellion finally gradually faded. Fan Xian resigned from his position as regent early in the morning. On the night the royal entourage returned to the capital, he returned the emperor's royal seal. Although he didn't resign and no one saw him as regent anymore, no one knew whether or not these minor mistakes would lead to a major disaster in the future. Each day he was late was one more day of danger. He continued to be the commissioner of the Overwatch Council and the transport envoy of the palace treasury. He no longer had to worry about the problems in court affairs. The court affairs were managed by the 2 scholars and a group of civil officials. The military was managed by the Bureau of Military Affairs. None of them had anything to do with him. Thus, other than Yin Bingyun occasionally coming to the manor to report on an errand in Jiangnan's, Su Wenmao, and Xia Qifei's timely delivery of council reports, there was nothing else for him to worry about. However, there were some interludes, such as how Sir Yin Jr. had survived. Fan Xian did not ask a single word. He didn't even want to go to the Overwatch Council, much less ask those annoying questions. On the contrary, it was Xia Qifei's letter that the old Ming master in Jiangnan had hanged himself after learning of the eldest princess' defeat. This made Fan Xian sigh with emotion. Ming Qingda had finally died. Thinking of how he had fought with this old man for a long time in Jiangnan, and had not expected him to die like this, Fan Xian couldn't help but feel perplexed. He thought to himself that when the old man hung himself, perhaps he had used the white cloth he had given him. Perhaps it was because he had been tired by the string of matters in Jingdo, or perhaps it was because his old injuries had lingered. But Fan Xian was truly ill. After he recovered, he only stayed at home to hold his child, comfort his wife, and be filial to his old man. He hid in the little building and did not care about the north, south, east, and west winds outside. He enjoyed his family and was very happy. Jingdo gradually calmed down. After the surviving officials had settled their thoughts, they began to return to their usual days of currying favor. Everyone knew that during this month, Sir Fan Jr., who had done the most in quelling the rebellion, rarely entered the palace. He only stayed at home with his child. They couldn't help but feel confused. Some people who thought they were clever thought the emperor had other thoughts. Later, news gradually came from the palace. It was said that the emperor greatly likes Sir Fan Jr.'s little girl. Even allowing Sir Fan Jr. to rest for a month was the emperor's grace. Thus everyone knew what they had to do. The Empress Dowager had just passed away, and all of Jingdo had turned white. In accordance with etiquette, all entertainment and pastimes had been stopped, and the restaurants had to be closed for a month. The Fan Manor had a joyous occasion, so they could not make a big fuss. They didn't even hang a single red lantern outside the door. No matter how one looked at it, one could not see the joyous atmosphere. Every day at dusk, there would always be some officials sneaking into the Fan Manor, leaving behind gifts, and leaving without a word. The Fan father and son quietly accepted the gifts. As for the matters the officials had entrusted them with, they couldn't be bothered to pay attention to them. They knew why, in such a serious, intense time, those officials still took the risk to send gifts and use connections. After putting down the rebellion, a large number of the officials who usually followed the crown prince, the second prince, and the eldest princess had been taken down and locked up in the Overwatch Council's prison. Some of the officials who did not have a firm enough stance in the Jingdo matter had been chased out of the yamen by the emperor with a stroke of his pen. In all of the 6 ministries, including Dongshan Road and Jiangnan Road in the east, there were suddenly hundreds of empty spots. Cats loved fish, dogs loved poop, and officials loved positions. These hundreds of positions made their eyes red. How could they care too much? There had been too many changes in the palace. Many of the old connections had been cut off. Most of the people had no connection to the Dingzhou army, so no one dared to give gifts to the cold-faced great prince. Coincidentally, Sir Fan Jr. had given birth to a daughter, giving them a great opportunity to give gifts. They could not pass it up. After a month, Jingdo was finally settled. The Hall of Governmental Affairs drew up a list of the vacated positions in the various ministries, temples and courtyards, as well as the east and south roads. They filled in many of the candidates from the spring examinations. Most of them could be considered good and capable people. The officials whose names were written were overjoyed. They thought it was the gifts they had given to the Fan Manor that had worked. Those who were not chosen were secretly angry. The silver they had prepared at home was too little. Sir Fan Jr. indeed did not like it. That day Fan Xian held the child. As he lowered his head to play with the little girl's soft red lips, he said to his father, "I didn't say a word." Minister Fan drank a mouthful of sour berries and said with a slight smile, "I'm about to resign. Who has the patience to go into the palace to say it?" "Xiaohua, Xiaohua." Fan Xian smiled at his father, and then lowered his head to coax the child. During this month he had held the girl every day. He truly loved her more and more. Minister Fan glanced at him and suddenly said, "Although the emperor has an edict for you to rest, you've already rested for a month. You haven't gone to the Overwatch Council Yamen for a single day. What exactly are you hiding from?" Fan Jian's heart jumped. He was afraid that his father would see through his thoughts. He smiled and said, "When I can hide, I should hide. After marrying Wanner, other than when I was injured in the Hanging Temple, I haven't had such leisure days." When he mentioned the Hanging Temple, the corner of his mouth trembled slightly, but his father did not notice. During this month, he had hidden in the manor and refused to go to the Overwatch Council for one reason. He was very afraid of running into Chen Pingping. If he did run into Chen Pingping, he was afraid he wouldn't be able to resist asking him some things to confirm certain things. Although the old cripple would still choose to remain silent and separate out of love for him. If the old and young actually met, how would they interact? There were many things the emperor did not understand, but Fan Xian gradually saw them clearly. The clearer he saw, the colder his heart became, and the more worried he became. Just like this, a few days of leisure passed. Autumn grew stronger in Jingdo, and the weather grew colder and colder. Jingdo grew more and more stable, and the palace grew more and more peaceful. Most of the eunuchs and serving girls had survived and continued to serve people. Eunuch Dai, who had been reinstated, secretly sent out a message, saying that some of the people Sir Fan Jr. asked about were alive, and some were dead. He was very moved and said that only Sir Fan Jr. would care for these pitiful people like this. He then thought of how he had been in the past and so on. Asking for a few names was actually just a pretense. Fan Xian only wanted to confirm Hongzhu's punishment. However, the other news eunuch Dai spoke of made his expression freeze. Tomorrow, the palace was going to issue an edict. Fan Xian was well aware of the contents of the edict. The emperor's goal in offering sacrifices to heaven was to depose the crown prince. This edict had finally been issued. It only proved one thing. The person in the Eastern Palace had already, Perhaps that person had already left for many days. No one knew. Fan Xian lowered his head and drank his tea. He did not say a word. There was no sorrow on his face. It was so calm it made one's heart palpitate. Lin Wanner watched his expression from the side and knew what he was thinking about. Carefully she asked, "What's wrong?" "Tomorrow, I'm going into the palace," Fan Xian said quietly to her. "There are some things I need to report to the emperor." Lin Wanner gazed at him worriedly. Fan Xian comforted her and said, "It's nothing big. I just promised someone something." There were 340 Jingdo officials involved in the rebellion. Adding on their subordinates, trusted aides and family members, the emperor had captured 4,000 people. The Overwatch Council's prison had long been full. The Ministry of Justice and Supreme Court were also stuffed full of people. In the end, even the Western Academy of the Imperial College had been moved out to be used to lock up criminals. According to Qing law, those who rebelled would have their entire family executed. Even if there were cases of mercy outside of the law, it would probably still cost 2,000 or 3,000 heads. Fan Xian smiled bitterly and shook his head. He thought to himself, if it was the him of the past, perhaps these 2,000 or 3,000 heads would have fallen. What did it have to do with him? However, having lived to this day, he had long understood some principles. At least, he had to do what he promised someone. Furthermore, looking at the situation this month, the emperor's actions were becoming gentler and gentler. Fan Xian had some confidence that at least a few of those women and children would be able to live. Putting aside whether it was a blessing or not, just the crown prince's surrender had allowed the Qing kingdom's soldiers to live a few thousand more. Fan Xian had to repay this thought. Early the next morning, Fan Xian tidied up his official robes. A thought occurred to him. He turned around and picked up a piece of cloth to put in his clothes. This piece of cloth had Fan Xiaohua's red footprints on it when she was 1 month old. At the time, everyone in the manor had felt that Fan Xian's actions were strange. They had not thought that he was just reminiscing about the customs of many years ago. Now, he was taking this piece of cloth to prepare to attack the emperor's heart. Once he was ready, he climbed into the carriage. Unexpectedly, he saw the familiar person across the street smiling at him. Fan Xian lowered his head to look at his black Overwatch Council robes, and then at the pure white clothing the person wore. In a low voice he said, "I said I won't go, so I won't go. Even if you come every day pretending to be white impermanence and pull me, I still won't go." Yan Bingyan walked over with a slight smile on his cold face. "This is the director's intention. As a subordinate, I can only come and bother you every day. Are you going to enter the palace? Since you can enter the palace, you have to return to the council to handle council affairs. There's no need to wait for the director to go to the palace to ask for an edict." Fan Xian spat on the ground and suddenly thought of the matter of entering the palace. Furrowing his brows, he said a few words in a low voice beside Yan Bingyan's ear. Yan Bingyan looked at him with slight surprise. He thought that everyone had the right to punish traitors. Additionally, this matter was carried out according to Qing law. The emperor had not done anything overboard. Why did the commissioner have to enter the palace to admonish? He looked at Fan Xian like he was looking at a monster. Shaking his head, he said, "The council did not randomly capture people. Those people were definitely not wronged. I do not understand when your heart became so gentle." Chapter 590. How come you have time to come into the palace to see me today? The emperor raised his head and glanced at Fan Xian with a smile. There was a glimmer of mockery in his warm gaze. It looked like after a month, the emperor's mood had calmed down a great deal. For no reason, a glimmer of fear rose in Fan Xian's heart. He forced a smile and was speechless. Although this month's leave had been personally given by the emperor, not entering the palace for an entire month, and not seeing the emperor was indeed inexcusable. Clearly hearing the emperor's displeasure, he didn't know how to respond. He didn't enter the palace because of the glimmer of coldness and fear in his heart. Ever since he knew the emperor was a great grandmaster, Fan Xian, who had always been daring, finally understood what fear was. Particularly, the emperor's silence and tolerance these few days made him even more wary. If possible, he would rather never enter the royal palace again and never see the emperor's face again. The gentler he was, the more afraid he was. He swallowed a mouthful of saliva to moisten his dry throat. In a low voice, he sincerely spoke of the matter he had come to the palace to ask for. However, he didn't mention Crown Prince Li Chengqian's name. He only discussed the matter as it stood, and urged the emperor to be merciful when dealing with the matter of the rebellion. The victor was always tolerant. The emperor, who had lost a large number of his family members, was becoming more and more lenient. Fan Xian thought to himself. Furthermore, he was confident that someone as powerful as the emperor would not worry about the problem of a new life coming with the spring wind. Unexpectedly, the emperor's expression gradually darkened. It was as if he had not thought that Fan Xian would ask for such a thing on his rare visit to the palace. A thick coldness flashed through his eyes. Fan Xian secretly glanced at the emperor's gaze and thought to himself that things were going to be bad. Even if things were going to be bad, he still stubbornly persisted. It was not only because of what Li Chengqian had asked before his death. This also concerned his own courage. If it wasn't for this matter that made him find a glimmer of courage, he probably wouldn't have dared to enter the palace again. Thus he had to persist. It was because of this persistence that the royal study appeared very lively and terrifying. Eunuch Yao and the other eunuchs on duty outside the royal study paled in fright at the angry cursing coming from inside the room. They didn't know what Sir Fan Jr. had done to make the emperor so angry. Everyone listened nervously and fearfully outside the royal study. It was the sound of teacups crashing to the ground and bones shattering. Then, it was the sound of Sir Fan Jr. kowtowing, the emperor's cursing, and the sound of two people arguing. Eunuch Yao's expression did not change, but huge waves rolled in his heart. He thought to himself that Sir Fan Jr. was indeed daring to go head-to-head with the emperor. He couldn't help but worry about what would happen in a moment. He carefully stared at the door and wondered if he should quickly notify the two scholars of the Hall of Governmental Affairs. So many people had died in the royal palace. Of the people alive, there were only a few who had the right to mediate the dispute between the emperor and the Duke of Danbois. Before long, the two doors to the royal study were pushed open with a squeak. Fan Xian walked out with quick steps. His face carried an expression of anger and indignation. He didn't even glance at the eunuchs with their heads lowered outside. With a wave of his sleeves, he left the royal palace. Once he left the palace and got into the carriage, the anger and indignation on his face immediately disappeared. There was calm and slight worry between his brows. Of course, the emperor had severely reprimanded Fan Xian. No emperor, even those who were known to be the most benevolent, would have a sliver of sympathy for enemies who dared to plot for power in the world. Fan Xian should have thought this through clearly. He just didn't understand why the emperor still wanted to fight like this. After returning to his manor for a few days, there was still no news from the palace. There was also no edict to reprimand him. Fan Xian felt more and more uneasy. He thought that the emperor had probably guessed his intentions and had played a dirty trick on him. However, he had no other choice. He could only use his identity as the commissioner of the Overwatch Council to write a few secret memorials and continuously send them into the palace in an attempt to anger the emperor again. Unexpectedly, these secret memorials were like meat buns and big dogs. Clay bodhisattvas entering the river. There was not a single response. After a few more days, the palace finally settled on how to deal with the matter of rebellion. Fan Xian held the edict in his manor and felt greatly shocked and surprised. He had not thought that after his argument with the emperor in the royal study, the emperor would actually listen to him and raise the butcher's knife high only to gently bring it down. Among the captured rebel officials, as well as some people who had not been released, there were over 1,000 people sentenced to death by beheading. The women and children who had been implicated in the matter were basically dealt with lightly. Even for the rebel soldiers who had surrendered in the end, the emperor only chose generals of a certain rank and above to be killed. As for the common soldiers, they were scattered and sent to the various borders to fight for the country as prisoners on death row, with the intention of atoning for their crimes by performing meritorious deeds. In the end, it was calculated that about 2,000 people had died because of the rebellion. Unexpectedly, the emperor had long seen through his thoughts and played such a trick to raise Fan Xian up again. Even if he wanted to resign, it would be impossible. Fan Xian's face was heavy in the manner as he looked at his daughter. He thought to himself that he had indeed become much lazier with the emperor. However, he still didn't understand why the emperor had given him such glory with both hands. After thinking about it, he felt a bit annoyed. He slammed the table and stood up. Gritting his teeth, he said, "I even dare to enter the palace to see the emperor. Would I be afraid of seeing him?" Fan Xiaohua's eyes were tightly shut, but she did not cry in fright from the loud noise. It was Wan Er and Cece, who were beside her, who jumped in fright. They didn't know why he was so angry, and quickly took the child. After the Jingdo rebellion, the commissioner of the Overwatch Council, Fan Xian, returned to the Overwatch Council for the first time. All of his subordinates bowed respectfully to welcome him. Their expressions were serious. Through the countless things that had happened these few years, the entire Overwatch Council had completely accepted this future director and were deeply awed by his methods. Fan Xian sat in the dark room and wiped his hands with a wet towel. Pulling back the black cloth, he glanced at the royal palace not far away and shook his head. Chen Pingping was not here, but he could not immediately go to Chen Garden. He summoned a few leaders of the 8 bureaus and asked about the recent situation. He then had Yin Bingyan stay. Hearing his question, Yin Bingyan shook his head and said, "There is still no news of Sir Wang. As for Hong Chongqing's group, a few people have returned, but he himself has disappeared. The 7 Tiger Guards Gao de Brat should have all been killed by Siga Jian on Dong Mountain." Fan Xian's brows gradually furrowed. He felt very uncomfortable in his heart. Logically speaking, Wang Qinian was so cunning. How could he have quietly died on Dong Mountain? Even if a battle between great grandmasters was terrifying, there had to be a corpse. The Overwatch Council knew that Wang Qinian was his most trusted aide, so they shouldn't have missed it. As for Hong Chongqing and Gouda, he had no confidence at all. He thought that they had probably really gone. Thinking of this, his mood immediately became gloomy. He didn't linger in the Overwatch Council. Getting into the carriage, he headed straight out of Jingdo and toward Chen Garden. Between the green meadows outside Chen Garden, the usual murderous traps were no longer there. Fan Xian sat in the carriage and thought that the Qin family must have sent the Jingdo garrison to clean them out. After the carriage stopped outside Chen Garden, Fan Xian disembarked and looked at the scene in front of him. He couldn't help but freeze. This was no longer the once beautiful and unique Chen Garden. All he saw were broken walls and ruins, dry ponds and shattered mountains, drooping willows and traces of fire and smoke. It was a wretched sight. Chen Garden had been burned down, leaving behind a mess. However, it was not too desolate at the moment, because a few temporary houses made of bricks and wood had already been built at the back. Moreover, there were already over 1,000 craftsmen busying themselves on the original site. It looked like a bustling construction site. Fan Xian walked through the construction site with great difficulty. With great difficulty, he came to the back of Chen Garden and found Chen Pingping, who was being served by a dozen beautiful female attendants and listening to an opera. This old dog was dressed like a landlord. He sat on a low couch with narrowed eyes in enjoyment. His feet were covered by a blanket. Although it was noisy outside, and this temporary residence was far from comfortable, looking at his expression, he was very happy. The sound of stone being cut and bricks being laid outside completely suppressed the sounds of the opera inside. Fan Xian walked in and furrowed his brows. "How can I hear this clearly? It's not like you don't have a house in the capital. Why must you stay here? It will take at least 3 months for Chen Garden to be completely repaired. Are you going to spend 3 months here?" Seeing him walk in, Chen Pingping smiled. His smile made his wrinkles bloom like a chrysanthemum flower. Each petal was filled with a strange aura. Fan Xian's hair stood on end because of this smile. He didn't speak. He sat by his side and picked up a teacup to take a sip. The beautiful female attendants who had been glued to Chen Pingping's side knew that the little duke had come today to say something important. They did not look at Fan Xian lovingly like they usually did. Restraining their voices and calming their spirits, they withdrew. Outside, there were probably Overwatch Council officials giving orders. Even the sounds of repairing the garden had stopped. The ruins in front and behind Chen Garden all sank into silence. Chen Pingping glanced at him. Fan Xian moved closer and used the teacup in his hand to feed him a sip. Chen Pingping moistened his throat before saying, "It is not easy to live in Jingdo. It is better to live in this rundown garden." It was not easy to live in Jingdo. This was his reply to Fan Xian's deliberately natural words earlier, but there seemed to be some other meaning hidden within. Fan Xian immediately became unnatural. He knew that this old cripple knew that he had come today, because he had something to ask of him. Without waiting for Fan Xian to speak, Chen Pingping opened his mouth and said, "There are countless beauties in my garden. You know that." Fan Xian nodded. Chen Pingping coughed and then continued, "I take them in. They don't have to serve other stinky men. It should be considered a blessing. However, they follow a lonely old man like me every day. Presumably they are not happy in their hearts. Yet they don't dare show it in front of me." Fan Xian thought, of course this is true. In the entire world, other than the emperor, you are the most ruthless. No matter how much these teenage lawless and mature women in their 20s are controlled by hormones, they do not dare to have any complaints. There was a serving girl in the previous court who held a hidden grudge for too long. In the end, she strangled the emperor alive. Chen Pingping rubbed his neck and said, "I don't want to die like that, so I have to think of a way for the girls in the garden to live more comfortably." Fan Xian's heart jumped. He faintly guessed what the old man wanted to say. "I am very lenient with them. Even if they stare at you like a cucumber every time you come, I won't punish them." Chen Pingping yawned and said, "Furthermore, the reason they are dead set on me is that if one day they don't want to stay, I will chase them out of the garden. Leniency is the best way to maintain a garden." Chen Pingping looked at Fan Xian and said, "It is also the best way to maintain a family's peace. That is why the emperor has been so gentle recently." Fan Xian understood. Chen Pingping was probably using this method to persuade the emperor. "But I can casually let them out of the garden, because there are too many beauties with unfortunate backgrounds in the world." Chen Pingping gazed at Fan Xian and shook his head. "But the emperor will not let you out because he only has a few sons. Furthermore, 2 of them have just died." The old cripple extended 2 fingers and looked at Fan Xian with slight mockery. "Do you think that by standing up for the crown prince and those rebellious officials, you can truly anger the emperor and make him chase you far away? Don't be too optimistic. Such clumsy methods, who can you fool? The emperor scolded you in the royal study, not because he blamed you for pleading for those sinful officials. Rather, he blamed you for wanting to escape at this time." Fan Xian sighed. Right now he was afraid just looking at the emperor. How could he continue to stay in Jingdo? Thinking of that matter, he lowered his voice and asked with vexation, "Even if the emperor saw through my little thoughts, why did he have to play that game in the end? He sent down so many benevolent edicts. Isn't it all on my head? Benevolent edicts and reputation are shackles. The emperor can't bear for you to leave." Chen Pingping coughed again and suddenly laughed. He examined Fan Xian's bitter face with great interest. "Have you never thought about why the emperor would harm himself to help your reputation?" Fan Xian's heart chilled. He thought of a possibility he had never thought of. His entire body froze. Sitting by the edge of the bed, he shivered. Seeing that he finally understood, Chen Pingping sighed and looked through the glass window of the temporary residence at the construction site outside. Then he slowly said, "He finally understood after so many people died. It's not in vain that I've spent so many years of effort." Fan Xian's lips trembled slightly. He suddenly rose and looked at Chen Pingping. "What about the 3rd prince?" "The 3rd prince, he is after all still young." Chen Pingping lowered his eyes slightly. "The emperor will not make a crown prince. However, if something happens and he leaves too early, choosing you to succeed is, of course, the best choice right now. My surname is Fan. I paid respects to the ancestors of the Fan family." Fan Xian's angry voice grew louder and louder. Chen Pingping glanced outside and furrowed his brows. "Why are you so loud? Not everything in this world can be justified by sound alone. Whoever has the biggest fist is justified. The emperor's fist is the biggest. As for whether your surname is Li or Fan in the future, isn't it all up to him?" Fan Xian sat down dejectedly. He had no idea that there was such a big matter hidden behind the emperor's recent warmth and benevolence. Given the emperor's present state, this matter may only happen after many years. Perhaps when the third prince grows up, the emperor will like him more than you. This matter will disappear with the wind. In any case, other than the emperor, you and me, no one else will know. Chen Pingping seemed to have thought of something. His expression dimmed slightly. He looked at Fan Xian for a moment and then said, "You haven't entered the palace for a month. It seems you have some opinions about the emperor. Why are you hiding?" Why did he hide from the emperor? It was because of the fear in his heart. Fan Xian faintly said, "I'm afraid." "What are you afraid of?" Chen Pingping looked at him and slowly said, "It's already been 4 years. You've already proven your loyalty to the emperor and obtained a rare trust. This was obtained at the price of almost dying a few times. You should confidently enjoy this kind of trust." Fan Xian was silent. After he entered the capital from Danzhou, he had indeed almost lost his life a few times. Regardless of whether it was the Hanging Temple, the Valley, or the Dong Mountain incident, no matter how he looked at it, the emperor did not suspect him at all. The reason the emperor trusted Chen Pingping so much was because Chen Pingping had once risked his life to save the emperor's life a few times. What kind of trust was the most solid? Naturally, it was to sacrifice himself for the emperor. Regardless of other matters, just based on the emperor's attitude toward you, it can be said that it is not bad. Think carefully about these years. The emperor has shown you a lot of favor. You should be grateful. Other matters? Fan Xian heard these words and didn't think too deeply about it. He thought about the palace treasury, the Overwatch Council, and the power and trust in his hands. Compared to the crown prince and the second prince, Fan Xian knew that the emperor's treatment of him was not as simple as making up for the regret of not seeing him for 16 years. Since ancient times, the emperor's family was heartless. Furthermore, he was only an illegitimate child. The emperor had many ways to understand what had happened many years ago, but he had chosen the path that was best for Fan Xian. That is why I don't understand what you are afraid of. Why you don't want to enter the palace. Why do you think of a way to escape? Chen Pingping looked at him and said. Fan Xian forced a smile. No matter how much the emperor trusted him and pampered him, he was in the end an emperor. Putting aside the matter of decades ago, just his cold-blooded attitude toward the members of the royal family and his incomparably powerful methods made him feel incomparably terrified. Once the emperor knew that he had hidden many things from him and even betrayed him, he would unyieldingly tear apart the father-son relationship and the righteousness of a ruler and official. Ever since he knew that the emperor was a great grandmaster, Fan Xian had begun to worry about one thing. Back then, he had once secretly snuck into the royal palace and stolen the key from Hongguang Palace. If the emperor had sensed this at the time and had endured it until now, what exactly was he thinking? It didn't matter if he smuggled with Northern Qi or took in 13th Wang. The confident emperor did not care about these things at all and would not suspect Fan Xian of treason. However, he would not allow anyone to hold that chest in their hands because that chest could threaten him. Fan Xian was certain of this, but he was not sure whether or not the emperor knew the chest was in his hands. There was a letter missing from the secret compartment under the bed in Hongguang Palace. Could the emperor have taken it? That was why he was terrified the moment he entered the palace. He didn't know where a large group of aces would appear to kill him. He was also worried that the emperor would take action and use the realm of a great grandmaster to smash him into mincemeat. Chapter 591. Yesterday I made a series of mistakes. First, I wrote in a hurry, resulting in too many typos. Then, when I was editing, I changed the content to the vote solicitation chapter. Fortunately, a book friend reminded me on QQ. Only then did I understand. This is a very annoying matter. As for being accused of changing it to be pretentious, it also made me angry for a while. If this was pretentious, then if I made a mistake in the vote solicitation, wouldn't that make me a fake A? I took a deep breath and immediately forgot about you. The world is so beautiful. I will not be irritable. The vote solicitation chapter had long been deleted yesterday. Now, I can only continue to solicit monthly votes. As the saying goes, sending off a comrade, soliciting monthly votes. Speechless, 2 lines of tears. Third is about to be lost. Friends, please cast monthly votes to support old cat. Regardless of whether Fan Xian was afraid or not, the matter had already happened. However, during these years, perhaps the emperor did not want to completely break off relations with the son he admired the most because of this matter. Or perhaps the emperor only knew Fan Xian had entered the palace, but did not think the chest was in Fan Xian's hands. Thus he remained silent. It seemed that this was some kind of tacit agreement, not to pursue the matter, to express a father's indulgence toward his favorite son. Furthermore, Fan Xian was indeed ruthless to himself. Even when faced with a desperate situation, he rarely used that powerful weapon. The only time he had used it was in an uninhabited primitive mountain forest. Additionally, the key in Hongguang Palace's secret compartment was still there, making the emperor guess some things incorrectly. Fan Xian furrowed his brows and sank into deep thought. He thought of the snow-like leaflets, and how he had entered the palace to eavesdrop on the conversation between the eldest princess and Zhuang Mohan. His heart immediately relaxed. He understood that the emperor must have thought he was only targeting the eldest princess, entering the palace to eavesdrop, and not for the key. But what about the letter? Fan Xian still could not understand. Tiredly, he sat on the side of the bed in silence. In reality, other than the matter of the chest possibly being exposed, his fear of the emperor was also because of another puzzle. This was a problem that troubled Fan Xian. Regardless of whether he accepted it or not, no matter what, the emperor was still one of his fathers, although he was certainly not the best one. In Fan Xian's heart, he had 3 fathers. Minister Fan was his closest biological father, and Qin Pingping could be considered a godfather. However, the emperor's figure was also gradually invading his thoughts. Qin Pingping's words interrupted his train of thought. If you didn't enter the palace because you were afraid, then why didn't you return to the Overwatch Council and see me? Don't tell me you're afraid of me too. Looking at the old cripple's smiling appearance, Fan Xian sighed in his heart and thought, isn't he also afraid? I'm just afraid that after seeing you, I won't be able to resist asking some questions. Although he was afraid, he still opened his mouth to ask. Since he had the courage to come, he was naturally prepared. He did not want to be a pitiful zergling that was kept in the dark. How did Yin Xiaoyi's trusted soldiers get to Dong Mountain? Why didn't the Overwatch Council have any intelligence? Why was the situation in Jingdo so dangerous? Why was there no news of the unusual movements of the officials of Dongshan Road? Why didn't you return to Jingdo and allow the eldest princess and Empress Dowager to torment you until you finally tormented yourself to death? This is the plan that His Majesty and I came up with. Of course, we have to hide it from the world. Qin Pingping glanced at him coldly and said, if I didn't show weakness first, how could these people jump out? Fan Xian shook his head. Don't lie to me. I know you can certainly give the emperor a good explanation after this. Only you and I know that these people were forced by us to oppose the emperor. Furthermore, you know that although the emperor appears to have achieved great success this time, he is actually walking on a tightrope. The slightest bit of carelessness would cause him to fall into the bottomless abyss. Since you knew about this long ago, you must have the ability to make this situation better, and not let Jingdo sink into a situation of eternal damnation. The emperor trusts you, but that doesn't mean I trust you. Fan Xian stared at Qin Pingping's old face and lowered his voice. This is the emperor's plan, but you've been going along with it. Although you've only pushed it a little, it has increased the danger the Qing kingdom faces by 10 times, or even 100 times. Even if you want to get rid of internal trouble, you can't have so many people die. No matter how ruthless the emperor is, presumably, he wouldn't want to see this final situation. There are dogs in the world who would chase them. After a long silence, Qin Pingping said, if you want to beat the dogs, you have to beat them all to death. I'm afraid the emperor's heart will soften for a moment. Does this explanation make sense? It doesn't. Fan Xian shifted in his direction and held his thin hand. In a heavy voice he said, even if it makes sense logically, the emperor's heart will not be comfortable, particularly if he thinks about it later. There will always be problems. What problems could there be? This is the emperor's grand plan. I am just an executor. Chen Pingping very naturally pulled his hand out of Fan Xian's and coldly said, "Don't think too much. There aren't too many complicated things in this world." There aren't. Fan Xian's heart was filled with worry and anger. He stared into his eyes and said, "Then tell me, why did you have the shadow assassinate the emperor at the Hanging Temple? Why did the old Qin master's body have an additional wound on the back of his waist?" Chen Pingping slowly raised his head and furrowed his brows as he looked at Fan Xian. "You went to see the body?" Fan Xian nodded and said, "I know that was the shadow's attack." He paused and then smiled bitterly. "However, since I saw it naturally, there is no wound now." "I didn't think you would be so meticulous," Chen Pingping said. Chen Pingping said, "I was the one who ordered the shadow to attack in the floating temple. You can report me to the king now. But you should know that the shadow has two mysterious identities. Aside from you and me, no one else knows this. Not even the king knows." Chen Pingping nodded. Fan Xian angrily said, "Even so, you still won't say it?" "Say what? Why did the old Qin master betray the emperor?" This was the question the eldest princess had Fan Xian asked Chen Pingping before she died. Now he finally bravely asked. "Betrayal never needs a reason." Chen Pingping was as cold and severe as ever. "You had the shadow kill Qin Yi. Were you afraid I would find out something from his mouth?" Chen Pingping laughed coldly and couldn't be bothered to reply. He waved his hand to signal for the guests to leave. Fan Xian stared at him coldly. A moment later, his gaze helplessly softened. Using a pleading tone, he said, "I know you are afraid of dragging me down, which is why you want to separate. However, such a major matter, you have to think about yourself." Chen Pingping's heart was filled with tenderness, but his face did not show it. "You're thinking too much." Fan Xian was silent and speechless. Although Chen Pingping still refused to admit it, he knew from the other party's attitude that his guess was certainly correct. The Qin family must have participated in the Taiping courtyard matter. The reason for their betrayal was because of his rise. What kind of person was the old Qin master? Although he was old, he knew that if the emperor truly wanted to use Fan Xian, he would have to clean up the matter of the past. The Qin family must have died, so the Qin family must have rebelled. This was the logic. However, behind this logic was a bloody and sinister reality. Fan Xian stood and gazed at Chen Pingping in silence for a moment. He then said, "After all, they are my father and mother. You've already worked hard for so many years. You should think about yourself more." "I don't have many years left. You've said it yourself." Chen Pingping smiled. Fan Xian gazed at him with some bitterness and said, "No one can defeat him." Chen Pingping was silent. Fan Xian prepared to leave when he suddenly said, "The chest is in my hands." Chen Pingping abruptly raised his head and saw that the young man had already walked resolutely out the door. He couldn't help but shake his head. He thought, "So what if the chest is in your hands? I can't drag you into this matter." After an indeterminable amount of time, a middle-aged man in casual clothing walked into the side room Chen Pingping was in and sat down beside him. It was exactly where Fan Xian had been sitting earlier. "No one can defeat the emperor," the middle-aged man said evenly. "On this point, my thoughts are the same as Nji's." This middle-aged man was none other than Fan Xian's father, the Minister of Revenue Fan Jian. No one knew when he had come to Qin Garden, or why he was speaking so calmly with Chen Pingping. The legend in officialdom was that in the past dozen years, Chen Pingping and Fan Jian had always been like fire and water. It was not until Fan Xian entered the capital that the relationship between the two sides gradually improved. Chen Pingping closed his eyes and calmly said, "Do you know the chest is in his hands?" Fan Jian smiled bitterly and said, "This child, he put the chest under the bed and thought he could hide it from everyone under heaven. How cute." Chen Pingping opened his eyes and glanced at him. "In your own manner, do you not have the ability to help him keep a secret?" "I do have this ability," Fan Jian said evenly. "The emperor has placed 2 spies in my home. Nji discovered one a long time ago, and the other died a long time ago. In any case, these kinds of spies don't cost money, so the emperor doesn't care." "Doesn't care?" If he didn't care, then he wouldn't have brought all of the tiger guards to Dong Mountain this time, for that madman Siga to chop up for fun. Chen Pingping looked at him with slight mockery and said, "You've only cared about small things your entire life. All of your strength was put into those tiger guards. Now that they've all died, no matter how many people you hid inside, not a single one is left. The emperor is truly ruthless this time." "Yes, I don't have much strength left." Fan Jian smiled bitterly. "So, I can only resign and return home." He looked at Chen Pingping and smiled coldly. "How much better can you be than me?" During the battle at Jingyang Gate, thousands of your Overwatch Council elites died. In another 2 years, the emperor will add a few more grains of sand. Other than learning from me and retiring, what else can you do? Chen Pingping laughed coldly and said, "As long as Fan Xian is still alive, the emperor will not go all out against the Overwatch Council. What do I have to worry about?" On the other hand, Lin Ruofu, that old fox, has endured for so long and finally found an opportunity to hand over all of the people he had hidden to his precious son-in-law. In the end, he is probably vomiting blood in Wuzhou right now. Fan Jian also smiled and said, "Everyone else thought that the officials of the Lin faction had followed Enji to fight against the crown prince, and would be heavily rewarded afterward. Unexpectedly, the emperor had been waiting to see this scene." Seeing the last of Prime Minister Lin's people jump out, even if they can't do anything now, how can they have a chance to turn things around in the future? External enemies and internal troubles have all been eliminated. He has also chopped off half of our arms. Fan Jian sighed. The emperor can truly be said to be wise and mighty. He has exceptional talent in his heart. It must be admitted, just like when we began to follow him many years ago. Chen Pingping closed his eyes and slowly said, "He is, and will be the most powerful person in the world." After a death-like silence, Minister Fan sighed and said, "I hid in King Jing's manor in Jingdo, because I was not worried about the situation in Jingdo. I had long seen that there was a problem with the Yi family. However, I had not thought that the emperor was actually a great grandmaster. I had somewhat guessed at the emperor's unfathomable power," Chen Pingping said coldly. "However, I had not thought that Yi Luyan, that strange old creature, would suddenly stand on the emperor's side. The two of us only guess one side of the emperor if..." Minister Fan suddenly stopped talking. Chen Pingping knew what his old comrade was about to say and calmly said, "There is no if. After that matter, you were never willing to believe me, and I was never willing to believe you. I never thought that the person I should have trusted the most might have had some problems." "And Ji once said something," Minister Fan said. Minister Fan said, "If you and I had more trust in each other, perhaps things would have been much easier. It was at that time that I knew this son of mine was extraordinary. We hid it so well, yet he was still able to guess this matter. He is the son of Xiao Yi and the emperor. Of course he is extraordinary." Chen Pingping furrowed his brows. In his heart, he still had the highest respect and admiration for the emperor. "When did you guess that the emperor was a great grandmaster?" Minister Fan's heart was very light as he casually asked. "It's been a few years." Chen Pingping's brows gradually relaxed as he thought of the events of the past. At that time, the Wei Kingdom was still standing in the center of the land. The power of the country was very powerful. When the Qing Kingdom first went on a northern expedition, the battle was very difficult, particularly in one battle. At the time, the emperor, who was still the crown prince, was heavily injured. His entire body was stiff and unable to move, and he almost lost his life. It was all thanks to Chen Pingping risking his life and going through many hardships to save him. This was one of Chen Pingping's most famous deeds. It was as famous as the Thousand Li surprise attack and the capture of Xiao In at the price of a broken leg. Minister Fan furrowed his brows and said, "What's wrong with that? We old people always thought that it was after that heavy injury that the emperor lost his martial arts. Back then, he was a fierce general. That injury was a bit strange," Chen Pingping slowly said. "His entire body was stiff. It was definitely not caused by external injuries. Lady Ning and I took care of him all the way. So of course, we know that it should be a problem with his meridians. It seems that all his meridians were broken. We thought he was dead for sure and cried a few times. Who knew that he would come back alive in the end?" I've never seen a person who can still live with all his meridians broken. Chen Pingping opened his eyes and looked at Fan Jian. Slowly he said, however, I later saw a similar person. It was your son. During the Hanging Temple incident, Fan Xian's meridians were also greatly damaged, but they were not as terrifying as the emperor's in the past. Furthermore, later in Jiangnan, he must have learned old Baldiku's skills and gradually recovered, Chen Pingping said. The emperor did not have Fan Xian's good luck. He did not learn Tianyi Dao, so how did his injury heal? These years, you've spent less time with the emperor than I have, Chen Pingping continued. Chen Pingping continued. No matter how much the emperor can endure, some details will always give the game away. Fei Jie reported back from Danzhou about the tyrannical martial method Fan Xian practiced, and said that this tyrannical jinxi could cause serious consequences. It made me think of the emperor who was once stiff all over and looked like a cripple. The Hanging Temple incident wanted to force him a little and see what his trump card was. Unfortunately, it was blocked by Fan Xian. Speaking of this, he glared at Minister Fan. At that time, it was this father who wanted his son to save the emperor and instead ruin Chen Pingping's grand plan. Since you understand everything, then let's not talk about it anymore. You also have to think through this matter. Fan Jian stood freely and said, I'm going back to Danzhou to retire. If you have time, you can come visit me. Chen Pingping was silent. He knew what his old comrade was thinking. Regardless of whether or not the emperor was undefeatable, he was, in the end, Fan Xian's biological father. No one knew that Fan Xian was a transmigrator. His soul carried a different element. These two elders only thought, based on common sense, that even if Fan Xian knew the truth, he would still be stuck in a dilemma. The two of them didn't want Fan Xian to live under too much pressure, so they had to think through this matter. Chen Pingping gently knocked on the copper bell beside the table. After a crisp ring, the old servant who had served him for many years walked in and carried him to the wheelchair. I'll see you off. Chen Pingping lowered his head and coughed. It was a difficult cough. His sleeves were covered in spittle. It took a moment for it to calm down. He said self-mockingly, my body is getting worse and worse. I've been poisoned, and I can't cure it for a long time. Fan Jian looked at him quietly and didn't say anything. He walked out of the manor. Behind him, the old servant pushed the wheelchair and followed. They didn't walk very far. In front of the construction site, the two of them stopped, looked at each other and bowed. I've thought it through, Chen Pingping said to Fan Jian. Fan Jian didn't immediately reply. Instead, he lowered his head and thought for a moment. He didn't know if these words were true or false. He knew why Chen Pingping had come to see him off. Many years ago, they had once gone to the shores of the East Sea and gathered together in Taiping Courtyard. They had once created a great situation. However, as time passed, some people had died, some people had changed, and some people had to retreat. He had resigned and returned to Danzhou. Only Chen Pingping was left in Jingdou to accompany the emperor. Presumably, he should also feel lonely. Just as Fan Xian said, during these dozen years, he and Chen Pingping had suspected each other. Their interactions had gradually decreased, but it could not erase the comradeship of the past. When it was time to withdraw from the stage, it had to be completely withdrawn. Back then, Lin Ruofu was not a member of the three-man group, so his withdrawal was not thorough enough. Minister Fan would not make this mistake. In front of the emperor's might, other than retiring, they did not seem to have any good choice. Before Fan Jian left, he furrowed his brows and asked one last question. He did not avoid the old servant. Since you suspected me back then, why did you have Wu Zhu take him to Danzhou? Chen Pingping sat in the wheelchair and lowered his head for a moment. He then slowly replied, because I know you once paid a price for it, so I want to continue to see your heart. A self-mocking and sad smile rose to the corners of Fan Jian's lips. He waved his hand and didn't say anything more. Watching Fan Jian's departing figure, Chen Pingping gently leaned against the wheelchair. His finger unconsciously tapped against the armrest of the wheelchair. He sighed and quietly said, it's good that he's gone, it's good that he's gone. Immediately after, the leader of the Qing Kingdom's darkness said gloomily to himself, in the end he is his father. How could I bear to force him? The old servant silently pushed the wheelchair back and listened to the old director say tiredly, "Tell me, why is it so difficult for someone to die?" Chen Pingping had done countless earth-shattering things in his life and faced countless dangers and hardships. But he had never been as disappointed as he was today. The enemy he faced was, without question, the most powerful person he had ever met in his life. Furthermore, that person could not find any weakness. The old servant said in a raspy voice, "It shouldn't implicate the Duke." He could already see the heaviness in his master's heart, so he did his best to ease it. Even if the Emperor can find something, after the Hanging Temple, and in Little Snow Valley, I have already caused Enji to almost lose his life twice. Is this still not enough to sever my relationship with him? Enji's luck has always been good. The Emperor will certainly not suspect him. Let's just let this matter rest. Chen Pingping was slightly afraid of the cold, and pulled the blanket closer to his body. Fan Jian was ready to leave. Chen Pingping had given up, and Fan Xian had thought it through. The biggest problem in the world seemed to have been solved. However, all three of them knew that if there were no major disturbances in the future, then this pot of boiling oil could be safely covered by the lid. But if something were to happen, the oil would jump out and burn everything cleanly. Not to mention the fact that the boiling oil was in their hearts, and it would burn them to the point where they hissed in pain. Chapter 592. Outside Shangjing, heading north from Shi Mountain, one came to the green and serene mountain. This mountain appeared normal, but in the hearts of the people, it was unusual. This was where the Tianyi Dao school was. Master Ku He's disciples and grand disciples studied and practiced here. After they left the mountain, they pointed their swords at the world and helped the people in need. Now Qing Mountain was filled with sadness. All of the Tianyi Dao disciples looked at the black building at the top of the mountain with uneasy expressions. They clenched their fists tightly and pressed their lips together. Their eyes showed fear, and they didn't say a word. Occasionally, people would pass by the stone path and head toward the top of the mountain. Their faces were heavy, and they didn't even glance at these Tianyi Dao disciples. There were many people going up the mountain. They were of high status, including many nobles, officials, and famous generals in Shangjing, such as the Grand Tutor Zhuang Mohan had single-handedly taught Chang Ningho, various officials, and about half of them were students who had left the mountain. Now they had all returned to the mountain, other than Shang Shanhu, leading the southern border, to resist the attacks of the Qing kingdom's Yanjing and Sangzhou's northern expedition camp. All of the talented and powerful figures in the northern Qi court had gathered on Qing Mountain because of this matter. In other words, northern Qi's Shangjing, the center of politics, had completely shifted to Qing Mountain. The Tianyi Dao disciples guessed what had happened at the top of the mountain. Only that major matter would alarm so many people. Their faces grew increasingly sorrowful. At noon, the northern Qi emperor, dressed in casual clothes, stepped onto the stone path up the mountain with a heavy expression. By his side was Lang Tiao. Behind him was Friar He. Guards were scattered at the foot of the mountain path. They didn't wear dragon robes and didn't display their royal chariots. Instead, they hurried up the mountain with dark expressions. The Tianyi Dao disciples knelt on either side of the stone path. They felt even more fearful. They knew that the protector of the Qi kingdom, the Grand Master closest to a god, was about to leave this world. On Dong Mountain, the tyrannical Zhenqi that the Qing emperor had cultivated for decades poured into Master Ku He's body with the power of the way of the emperor. The accumulation of decades of cultivation was like an ocean. In an instant, it burst apart Master Ku He's old body, being carried back into northern Qi territory by Shang Shanhu. Master Ku He sat cross-legged in the Qingshan Taoist school without a word. He had not eaten a grain of rice, and his expression was calm. The skin on his body began to gradually split open, revealing the blood vessels and tendons within. It began to disintegrate. It looked very terrifying. Fortunately, a large, soft robe was draped over the great Grandmaster's body, preventing the disciples who were serving him from feeling any more sorrowful. Since early in the morning, there had been an endless stream of people coming from Shangjing. The various nobles and officials all wore the etiquette of a disciple to pay their respects. After seeing Master Ku He, they knew that this should be the last time they would see the imperial advisor. The second disciple, Mu Peng, who had not been able to rest in peace even before his death, had been nervously adjusting his master's breathing. The expression on his face was somewhat vicious, but he could not say anything. The summons before his death was an order from Master Ku He. Each person only saw a moment. It was only when they saw the Grand Tutor that Ku He said a few more words. Ku He had protected this country for decades. Today he was going to leave. Even though he understood life and death, there was still something he could not let go of: this country. Today was his final farewell to this country, and his final account. Regardless of whether the Grand Master died or not, his words would certainly have a great influence on this country. Thus, he wanted to use his last moments to say a few words to these officials who controlled the Northern Qi court. He wanted to lay a more stable foundation for the emperor's future governance. Ku He looked at the military general in front of him and unconsciously sank into some kind of deep thought. There was nothing wrong with the emperor's ability. It was just that he was still young. Although Shen Zhong had been executed and Shang Shan who had submitted, if he truly died, would he be able to control the power of the military? The military general was the head of the Bureau of Military Affairs. After receiving a few words from the imperial advisor, he didn't hear any sound. He couldn't help but raise his head in fear to glance. In Northern Qi, regardless of whether it was the royal family or the generals, they all had boundless respect for Master Ku He. Ku He was different from the Qing kingdom's Yi Luyan. From the beginning, he had spread his influence and power into every crevice in the Northern Qi court. The second disciple of Tianyi Dao, Mu Peng, moved closer to his teacher's ear and quietly said, "The Emperor and Empress Dowager have both arrived. Should we call them in?" In the entire world, only Ku He had the right to call the Emperor and Empress Dowager. Ku He calmly shook his head. When the skin on his neck touched slightly with his clothing, there was a tearing pain. This kind of pain was, without question, something that humans could not endure. However, it was as if he didn't feel anything. He only furrowed his brows slightly. Mu Peng knelt to his teacher's left. Looking at the bloody marks on the back of his teacher's clothing, his heart was filled with grief. He couldn't resist crying. With this cry, the head of the Bureau of Military Affairs kneeling in front of Master Ku, he also felt sorrow. Adding to his fear for Northern Qi's future, his eyes grew wet. He knelt and crawled 2 steps forward. Fiercely kowtowing 3 times in front of Master Ku He gritted his teeth and said, "General Shang Shan who is in the south, and I am in Shangjing. Unless we die, we will not allow the court to be harmed in the slightest. Even if we die, we will protect the emperor's safety." Ku He glanced at him with a gentle gaze and warmly said, "It's been 12 years since you left the mountains. The future of the Qi kingdom needs your heart and your life." The head of the Bureau of Military Affairs kowtowed again, gritted his teeth, stood up and left. As he walked out the door, his eyes were slightly red. Unexpectedly, he saw the ashen-faced emperor and couldn't help but sigh. The Northern Qi emperor had been waiting outside the room for a long time. Seeing his official's slightly red eyes, his heart thumped as if it had sunk into an endless abyss. Raising his feet, he charged into the room. Beside him, Lang Tiao pulled on his sleeve. The Northern Qi emperor turned his head and glared coldly at Lang Tiao. Unconsciously, Lang Tiao felt a glimmer of fear. Although the emperor had followed him to learn martial arts, he still did not have much talent in martial arts. However, the might of an emperor grew stronger and stronger. "You can come in." Master Ku He's voice faintly rang out from outside the room. The Northern Qi emperor tidied up his clothing. With a serious expression, he turned and led the Empress Dowager's hand into the room. Inside the doors at the top of the mountain, other than Ku He, who was sitting on the ground like a withered tree, there were only a few of his closest disciples, as well as the Emperor and Empress Dowager. He was indeed like a withered tree. Although there was a wide and soft robe covering the great Grandmaster's body, everyone who saw Ku He felt a chill in their hearts. It was as if, through the thin robe, they could see the cracks on the imperial advisor's body like a dry field, as well as the faint bloodstains on his collar. Such a heavy injury was indeed impossible to heal. The Northern Qi Emperor's heart chilled. Without any pretense, he knelt cleanly in front of Ku He and kowtowed one last time to him. Granduncle. Everyone under heaven bowed to the emperor. The emperor never bowed to anyone. However, the Northern Qi Emperor had bowed to Ku He twice and kowtowed twice. The first time was when he was very young. At that time, the previous emperor had just passed away. The Empress Dowager had held the little emperor, as they sat in the beautiful main hall of the royal palace in Shangjing and kowtowed to Master Ku He. Ku He had guaranteed the safety of the mother and son for over a dozen years. He had ensured that the Northern Qi royal family was surnamed War, and allowed the little emperor to grow up. This second kowtow was the Northern Qi Emperor bidding farewell to his granduncle. In his heart, he had always felt a sense of distance and fear toward this deified granduncle. However, he felt even more gratitude. The Empress Dowager sat by Ku He's side. She lowered her head and wept silently. "All right, who won't die?" Ku He lowered his eyes slightly and quietly said, "I have already lived for so many years. It can be said that I have benefited greatly from heaven. Everyone will die, and that person in the Qing kingdom is no exception." Ku He had not personally spoken of the truth of what happened on Dong Mountain. Shang Shan, who had only guessed a little, and reported it to the royal palace in Shangjing. Hearing Master Ku He say this, the Northern Qi Emperor's heart chilled. He knew that it was indeed so. His counterpart in the Qing kingdom was extremely powerful. Looking at the emperor's expression, Ku He lightly said, "Are you afraid?" The Northern Qi Emperor pressed his lips tightly together. He didn't know how to reply. In his life, he had been the goal the Qing Emperor had fought for. He even faintly saw the Qing Emperor as his idol. He only thought that one day, he would defeat the Qing Emperor. Now, he found that the Qing Emperor's silent endurance these dozen years was all an illusion. Such a far-sighted emperor was much more experienced and ruthless than him. Furthermore, the Qing Emperor was a great grandmaster. "Fear is a very normal emotion," Ku He faintly said. Ku He faintly said, "When his finger touched the space between my brows, even I felt a glimmer of fear. This person has the heart of an emperor and the strength of a great grandmaster. There is not a single weakness or opening on him. Most terrifying of all is his perseverance. For the sake of his goal of sweeping through the wilderness, he was able to plan for decades. He was single-minded and never made any mistakes. Such a person is not like a person at all." Ku He smiled slightly and gave the Qing Emperor an evaluation. "Everyone falsely claims that I am the one closest to a god in the world. No one knows that the one in the south, who is emotionless, without hate, without love, and without separation, is the true God. Is there really nothing we can do about the Qing Emperor?" The person who asked this question in a trembling voice was Lang Tiao. He knew that the emperor also wanted to ask this question. However, as an emperor he could not speak. A person who stands at the pinnacle of martial arts, worldly power, and wisdom. Such a person is naturally impossible to defeat. Ku He was a bit tired. He closed his eyes and said, "It is basically impossible to defeat him from the outside." The Northern Qi Emperor was still kneeling in front of Ku He. Two glimmers of emotion flashed through his eyes. Suddenly he bowed and said, "Granduncle, I am going to worship the temple." The temple. When these two words came out of the emperor's mouth, the entire room fell silent. None of the 6 people said anything. Lang Tiao and Bai Shun met each other's eyes and saw the shock in the other's eyes. Mu Peng gently supported his teacher's body and glanced at the emperor with astonishment. In an instant, the emotions in the eyes of the 3 eldest disciples of Tianyi Dao became serious and faintly excited. In the present world, no one could defeat the Qing Emperor. However, there was still the temple. Given the power of an immortal, was there nothing they could do against a mortal? The temple was illusory. It was only a myth or legend. The 6 people in the room all knew that after Shaoen's death, there was only one person who knew of the temple's existence and where it was. It was Ku He. The Northern Qi Emperor had never given up on the thought of worshipping the temple and obtaining the support of a mysterious power. Back then, he had wholeheartedly rescued and imprisoned Shaoen. He had even clashed head-on with Ku He's faction because he wanted to know the secret in Shaoen's mind. The temple. Master Ku He slowly opened his eyes and looked at the emperor kneeling in front of him. The Northern Qi emperor had thought that his granduncle's gaze would be sharp and angry, because the only person in the world who had been to the temple was him. Furthermore, he had always hidden the true existence of the temple from the entire world at all costs. However, there was only faint mockery in Ku He's eyes, as well as the glimmer of a complicated smile. He knew, including his disciple, that when faced with the powerful Qing ruler, everyone unconsciously had the thought that they could not defeat him. That was why they had placed their hopes on the illusory temple. I know where the temple is. Ku He once again slowly closed his eyes. But I won't tell you. Shock appeared on the faces of everyone beside him. They thought, if you are going to take this secret to the yellow dirt, how can the Qi kingdom be protected? Ku He closed his eyes and quietly said, the temple is just a pair of eyes. It has never interfered with the affairs of the world. Why disturb it? Without waiting for anyone to reply, a self-mocking smile appeared at the corners of Ku He's lips. Besides, do you really think the temple is omnipotent? He opened his eyes and stared at the emperor in front of him. With sincere and heartfelt words, he said, don't place your hopes on something that does not exist in hope. Your Majesty, before I went to Dong Mountain this time, I met with Sigurd and made sufficient preparations for the situation at the top of the mountain. Ku He looked at him and faintly said, do you know what we think the Qing emperor's final trump card is? The Northern Qi emperor shook his head in confusion. Although he was a supreme being, he still felt fear toward strange existences like the great grandmaster and the temple. Sigurd, and I thought that the Qing emperor's final support was someone from the temple. Ku He smiled warmly, but everyone else in the room was shocked. Did the Qing emperor have secret connections with the temple? Ku He smiled slightly and said, if it was only someone from the temple, then there is nothing to fear. What we fear is that the temple will break its own rules. However, the Qing emperor does not have the power to do this. No one in the world understood the temple better than Ku He. Although his understanding of the outside world was only a shallow level, he understood that person. That was enough. The temple did not interfere in worldly affairs. If someone truly came to help the Qing emperor, then the black-clothed blind man at the top of the mountain would certainly stand on the other side of the temple. This was why Ku He had never worried about this matter. There are no immortal emperors or saviors in this world. Ku He sighed and thought of the words that a mortal had once said to him, and Shaolin many years ago. When you reach the realm of a great grandmaster, you will discover that the temple is actually nothing more than this. An existence that does not appear in the world is no different from a dead object. Although he was about to die, his light words revealed a calm and accurate evaluation of the temple. Then what should we do? Although the fire in the Northern Qi emperor's heart still burned, and he would not give up on the thought of finding the temple, because of a few words from Master Ku He knew he couldn't ask anymore. Granduncle Ku He didn't have much time. When a person cannot be knocked down from the outside, we can only hope that some problems will appear on the inside. Ku He said quietly, if the Qing kingdom wants to send an army north, it will take at least 3 years. Your Majesty must think of all ways to delay this time a bit longer. Delay? The Northern Qi emperor repeated this in his heart and furrowed his brows. This was only a temporary solution. The longer we delay, the more beneficial it is for us, because no one knows what will happen on the Qing kingdom's side. You are talking about Fan Xian. The Northern Qi emperor looked at Ku He's old appearance in shock. Pressing his thin lips together, he firmly shook his head. Fan Xian is not enough to change the Qing emperor's mind. No one can. Furthermore, he is after all a Qing person. He cannot stand on the side of the Qi kingdom. Who knows? Master Ku He looked at him with a calm gaze. Fan Xian has always been different from anyone else. He is the Qing emperor's illegitimate child. Furthermore, the Qing emperor trusts him greatly. The Northern Qi emperor calmly expressed an opposing opinion. The Northern Qi emperor calmly expressed an opposing opinion. What I can give him, the Qing emperor can give him even more. Besides, even if he votes for me, it would be impossible for him to cause any harm to the situation under heaven. But you forgot, he is also the son of the young lady of the Yi family. Kuhi's smile appeared somewhat strange. Furthermore, you still underestimate Fan Xian's use. Don't always think of him as an immortal poet, a prince of the Qing kingdom, or a powerful official. These all appear to be important figures. His most important identity is actually the son of the young lady of the Yi family. He has already inherited and grasped many important things. The Northern Qi Emperor's heart jumped. He raised his head in astonishment to look at Master Kuhi. Huge waves churned in his heart. He understood the meaning behind his grandfather's words, but he did not dare believe it. To be able to share the benefits of the Jiangnan Palace treasury through Fan Xian's hands was already the best situation the Northern Qi Emperor could imagine. However, hearing his granduncle's meaning, he was hoping that Fan Xian would move the entire palace treasury to Northern Qi. Something like a great grandmaster can be used to create chaos in a country, but it cannot be used to conquer a country or build a country. He said warmly. The Qing Emperor will not go so far as to challenge the world alone. Military power and national power cannot be lacking. At the end of a war, it still relies on national power. Unless the Qing Emperor runs to Shangjing and becomes the enemy of tens of thousands of people. Kuhi's smile became amused. But he is such a serious person who wishes to write his glorious name in history. How could he be as crazy as Sigajian? The Northern Qi Emperor's lips were slightly dry. He still could not believe Kuhi's judgment. Fan Xian, he refused to be a prince. What right did he have to vote for him? Was it because of the agreement between him and Haitang? Who would believe that an empty agreement with no proof would make Fan Xian pay such a large price? Everyone else was silent, listening to the conversation between Kuhi and the Northern Qi Emperor. Kuhi gazed at the emperor and quietly said, "Even if you place your hopes on Fan Xian, you cannot show anything in these 2 years." Understood. I will immediately make arrangements to act against Fan Xija. Kuhi nodded and felt gratified in his heart. The emperor was indeed extraordinarily intelligent. He had only mentioned it slightly, and he already knew what to do to not arouse the Qing emperor's suspicions. As I said earlier, stall for time. Kuhi said with his head lowered. After I die, Mu Peng, immediately go down the mountain to the Qing kingdom. Everyone looked at Kuhi in surprise. They didn't know why he was giving his second disciple, Mu Peng, a mission at this time. Although there were not many Tianidao disciples, of the 4 disciples, Mu Peng had always been the most low-key and the weakest link. Other than medical skills, he had nothing else to rely on. You live on the mountain for a long time. Not many people in the outside world know what you look like. Kuhi gently coughed, but used his hand to cover it, not letting the blood spray out. Looking at his second disciple beside him, he said in an even voice, "I want you to go to the Qing kingdom. You don't need to do anything. Just think of a way to treat Chen Pingping's illness." Treat Chen Pingping's illness? Everyone was shocked. Who was Chen Pingping? He was the Qing Emperor's closest and most loyal official. Regardless of whether it was 30 years ago, or the Dong Mountain incident that had just happened in Jingdo, Chen Pingping had played the greatest role. Hearing that the Qing Emperor's old dog's health was getting worse and worse, and that he didn't have many years left to live, the people of Northern Qi and Dongyi all felt joy in their hearts. Yet, Master Kuhi had his disciple with extraordinary medical skills go treat his illness. Kuhi stared at Mu Peng sternly. "No matter what, I want you to guarantee that Chen Pingping will be able to live, and will not die of natural causes like sickness." These were heavy words. Although Mu Peng did not understand, he still lowered his head and agreed. Everyone in the room looked at Kuhi as if they wanted to hear an explanation. Kuhi was silent and did not speak. This was Kuhi's last move before he died. After stabilizing the internal politics of the Qi kingdom, he had turned his gaze to the south. He had already thrown out 2 moves. Chen Pingping's side was the one he pulled back from. Master Kuhi was not the emperor of the Qing kingdom. He did not weave a shocking situation that spanned decades. Instead, he had acutely captured a glimmer of light based on his understanding of that little fairy from a long, long time ago. Through his decades of spying on human nature, as well as the Dong Mountain matter, and some existences that had been slightly eliminated. He was guessing. He guessed that behind the current peace in the Qing kingdom hid an old trouble that tore apart people's hearts. If Chun Pingping died of illness or natural old age, then Kuhi's guesses about human nature would not be of any use. Thus, he had to ensure that Chun Pingping could live on well until one day in the future, when someone did not want him to continue living. Everything seemed to have been arranged. Kuhi had no more hopes for this world. He closed his eyes as if he was about to fall asleep. The Empress Dowager forcefully suppressed the sorrow and fear in her heart. In a trembling voice she said, "How will the Taoist sect be dealt with in the future?" Tianydao's Taoist sect was deeply rooted in the kingdom. The ascetic monks traveled through most of the world. Faintly, they still had some connection to the Qing temple system in the Qing kingdom. With such a great power, how exactly would they be dealt with after Kuhi's death? However, there were Kuhi's 3 main disciples in the sect. Due to their status, they could not open their mouths to ask. Kuhi's eyes remained closed as if he was tired. In a quiet voice he said, "Hand the Taoist sect to Haitang." Everyone bowed and accepted the order. The 3 main disciples, including Lang Tiao, were not surprised. The Emperor and Empress Dowager also knew that Kuhi had already made this decision many years ago. Everyone had long seen Haitang as the next leader of Tianydao. However, where was Haitang today? Everyone had questions in their hearts. It was said that Haitang was still on the mountain last night, but her whereabouts were unknown. When Master Kuhi was about to die, his most beloved disciple, the successor of Tianydao, was not by the master's side. "Haitang has gone to do some things," Kuhi said quietly with his eyes closed. "She will not return during these 3 years. The matters of Tianydao will be handed to Lang Tiao, and this mountain will be handed to your little sister disciple. He said these words to Lang Tiao and the other 2. Although the matters of Tianydao were handed to Lang Tiao, the mountain was the true foundation of Tianydao. Little sister disciple? Lang Tiao and the other 2 disciples looked at each other. Was he referring to the young lady of the Fan family? The Northern Qi Emperor's pupils constricted slightly. He immediately understood the meaning of these words. He began to prepare in his heart how to use this matter. Suppress Xia Mingji and allow Fan Ruoro's name to shine brightly on the mountain. The imperial advisor was indeed skilled. The more he did this, the more the Qing emperor would suspect that Northern Qi was purposely provoking him. On the contrary, he would not suspect Fan Xian. It would be safer for Northern Qi's last hope of survival. However, until now, the Northern Qi emperor still did not believe that Fan Xian would one day come to his country with an incomparably generous dowry. After handing over all the mundane matters, Kuhi closed his lips and didn't say another word. He calmly felt the life in his body flow away. Other than a slight sense of loss, there was also a glimmer of joyful understanding. It was as if everything that had happened these years floated before his eyes. In the end, those scenes stopped decades ago, on that seemingly endless patch of white snow. In his last moments, Kuhi thought of the shrieking vultures in the sky, and his subordinates who had fallen dead on the way. The never-ending night, the faint light in the tent in the darkness, the silent Shao-in, and the neatly arranged human arms at the edge of the tent. It was an incomparably majestic black-green temple built against the mountain. The blind man who killed his way out of the temple. The little girl who ran out of the temple. Human flesh was not very tasty. He had already lived for so many years, and knew what the temple was like. What was there to be dissatisfied with? Just like this, the great Grandmaster Kuhi sank into his memories, and passed away with a complicated smile. On an icy plain to the north of Northern Qi, a girl wearing clothes woven from animal skin was using the man language to greet the people of her tribe. The girl's face was bright red and full of smiles, but a faint sadness and confusion appeared in her eyes. The continuous years of snowstorms made it impossible for the northern man to survive on this wasteland. Thus, the tribe that the famous General Shangshan, who had been unable to subdue for many years, began to move around the tall sky veins and toward the warmer south. Many tribes had already settled on the grasslands to the northwest of the Qing kingdom. However, they had paid the price of many lives to obtain the acceptance of their distant relatives. There were also some tribes, as well as the old, weak women, who lived on the ice and snow wasteland to the north. Perhaps because the number of tribes had decreased greatly, the small amount of prey was able to support these people's survival. Not long ago, a girl who was said to have been lost from the Karna tribe came to these tribes and began to follow everyone to hunt and herd sheep. Everyone liked this girl because she was diligent and capable. No matter how fierce a horse was, it could only be obedient in her hands. No matter how fierce a beast was, it seemed to be afraid of hurting her and would run far away. The simple and straightforward man people just didn't like the way this Karna girl walked. In such a difficult environment, that kind of wobbly walking method seemed to waste too much energy. Chapter 593. On the last day, the situation for monthly votes is too dangerous. If anyone still has monthly votes, please vote them for me. Thank you. The flowers in the forest withered the red of the spring. The summer dream, the autumn wind too hurried. It was another winter in the Qing kingdom. The temperature seemed to have dropped within a day. Snow began to fall on the Tsang Mountains in the west of the capital. The mountaintops gradually turned white. 2 small bouts of cold rain fell in Jingdo, adding to the chill. The people on the streets were wrapped in thick cotton robes. They rubbed their hands and walked with hurried expressions. The carriages coming and going on Tianhe Avenue exchanged blows with the ground, making an irritating monotonous sound. The horses all breathed out impatiently and turned their heads. It was as if they wanted the winter to end faster. In a black carriage, Fan Xian flipped up his fur collar and blew a breath of hot air into his hands. He tightened the fur cloak on his body and muttered a few words. He thought to himself that the winter had come too quickly. He had just come out of King Jing's manor. King Jing was sick, very sick. Hongqing was not in the capital. Ro Jiao was also young. Fan Xian could only take on the role of an assistant. Every day, he went to serve the medicine, talk with him, and relieve the king's boredom. Given his present identity, it was indeed inappropriate for him to do such things. However, Fan Xian knew the relationship between King Jing's family and his own. Furthermore, he had always felt some remorse toward Hongqing, so he was particularly attentive. He knew why King Jing, who looked old but was actually in good health, had suddenly come down with a cold. None of this had anything to do with the winter. It was only related to the severe cold in the royal family. The Empress Dowager had died, the eldest princess had died, and half of King Jing's family had died in this incident. The cruel reality had finally knocked down the flower farmer king. Coming out of King Jing's manor, Fan Xian did not return directly to the manor. He also did not enter the palace. Instead, he went to Baiwa brothel. Today was the day Shi Chanli and Sang, when returned to the capital to report on their work. He had to learn the most secretive information in the world from the mouths of these 2 trusted aides. After staying in the building for a while, Fan Xian looked over the information that Baiwa brothel had gathered from the tentacles they had spread all over the world. He furrowed his brows and looked at Sang Wen's gentle face. He looked at the beard growing on Shi Chanli's lips and sighed. There was nothing special about this information. It was similar to the Overwatch Council's. 3 months had passed since the Dong Mountain incident. The entire world had entered winter. As early as 2 months ago, news of Master Kuhi's death had spread from northern Qi. The death of a great grandmaster shocked the people of the world, but it did not surprise Fan Xian too much. This was something that the emperor had already predicted. Fan Xian was only wary of what northern Qi would do in response to Kuhi's death. During these 2 months, northern Qi had been very quiet. Other than Shang Shanhu continuously defending against the Qing kingdom's probing attacks in the south, there had been no major movements. Fan Xian lowered his head and smiled as he thought about it. If Xia Mingji's stronghold in Shangjing was not taken into account, the northern Qi emperor had finally taken action against Fan Xizha. It was said that the second Fan elder was living in fear and unease in Shangjing. However, Fan Xian was not worried at all. From his sister's letter, he could tell at a glance exactly what the little emperor wanted to do and express to him. What made Fan Xian uneasy was that Haiteng Duo, this woman who had a close relationship with him, and the successor of Tianyi Dao, had suddenly disappeared without a trace. No one knew where she had gone. Even the internal members of Tianyi Dao did not know. He did not know that a famous doctor called Fengchun had already entered Jingdo, and was beginning to make a name for himself. He had received the attention of the Imperial Academy of Medicine. Because of his Northern Qi identity, he was still unable to enter the palace as an attendant. Instead, he was sent to the manors of various officials to demonstrate the emperor's favor. King Jing's illness was personally treated by Fan Xian, so Sir Fengchun had never met Fan Xian. No matter how clever Fan Xian was, he would not be able to guess that, in the near future, Sir Fengchun would go to Chen Garden to carefully protect Director Chen's life at all costs. The chess moves coup he had made before his death were all loose pieces. On their own, they did not have any effect. They only ensured that the internal situation in the Qing kingdom would continue to move step by step in a certain direction. Fan Xian was only worried about Haitang. He didn't know what coup he had told Haitang, when he would see her, or with what identity he would see her. There was also something that made the entire Qing court feel fear. Coup he was already dead. Northern Qi did not hold a funeral in secret. Instead, they held the ceremony with great fanfare. Hundreds of thousands of officials and commoners from various roads and provinces went to cry for the soul. The Northern Qi court did not seem to sink into a state of panic or unease because of Ku He's death. Sigu Jian, who should have already died in Dongyi according to the Qing emperor's calculations, had stubbornly held on and not died. This sword saint's body was as valiant as a cockroach. Although his breathing was weak and his life hung by a thread, he held onto this thread tightly and refused to let go. The dying Sigu Jian was hidden in the sword hut. Although this sword saint had become a cripple, his reputation was still there. All of Dongyi seemed to have a pillar of support. Problems also began to appear within Dongyi. After Sigu Jian's death, the dispute between the master of the city's manor and the sword hut was perhaps about to surface. For the Qing emperor, Sigu Jian's life and death was no longer a problem. After his death, the ownership of Dongyi was the major problem. Fan Xian lowered his head and thought. Dongyi was different from Northern Qi and the Qing kingdom. It was isolated by the sea and surrounded by vassal states. If Sigu Jian died, a ferocious beast would immediately become a delicious, tender piece of meat waiting to be cut. Regardless of whether it was the Northern Qi emperor or his own emperor, neither would let go of this piece of fresh meat. However, he didn't know who the emperor would send to steal it. He raised his head and glanced at Shi Chanli and Sangwon. He briefly told Shi Chanli about the situation in the Jiangnan Palace treasury. Although Su Wenmao endlessly sent him secret reports, Fan Xian still trusted Shi Chanli's instinctive impression more. The production of the palace treasury continued to maintain high efficiency. With Fan Xian's strong cooperation, the old shopkeepers of the Seven Leaves gradually raised the level of the three workshops to the level of the old Yi family. Fan Xian's heart felt slightly more at ease. He had two knives in his hands. One was the Overwatch Council, and the other was the palace treasury. Regardless of whether it was for the emperor's trust or for his own power, he had to hold on tight and do a good job. Of Fan Xian's 4 disciples, only Shi Chanli remained by Fan Xian's side. Hou Jichang, Yang Wanli, and Cheng Jialin were all fighting up in their respective positions. With Fan Xian's protection and financial support, in addition to their own abilities, presumably, it wouldn't be long before they became important figures in the Qing court. There are many vacancies in the court. The emperor has chosen many young people. At this time, age and experience are no longer important. Fan Xian gazed at Shi Chanli and smiled warmly. In a moment, write a letter to the 3 of them and have them prepare. At the beginning of spring, the court will probably summon them to the capital to report on their work. In his arrangements, Yang Wanli should be working in the Ministry of Works. Because Hou Jichang had handled the Jiaozhou matter, his position was particularly stable and deeply admired by the emperor. He should be directly promoted by 2 levels and become Jiaozhou Zhizhou. As for Cheng Jialin, his path had been smooth sailing. He was probably the most glorious person in the Suzhou government. Shi Chanli's mouth was slightly open. He had not expected that the 4 poor scholars would each have such good fortune in just a few years. He truly could not catch up. Fan Xian knew what he was thinking and asked with a smile, "What is it?" "Their experience is too shallow and cannot convince the masses. Most importantly, everyone in court knows that the three of them are your students. I'm afraid it will cause criticism, Shi Chanli said seriously. Fan Xian raised his eyelids slightly and mockingly said, "A few hundred officials have died. Someone has to fill in. Where would there be so many candidates with experience? Don't say his experience is shallow. Back then, He Zongwei was as famous as Ho Jichang and entered the court after Jichang. Now he already has the right to enter the royal study to listen to discussions. Is his experience deep enough?" He Zongwei was a name that Fan Xian had a deep memory of. Back then, in the restaurant of Isher Tavern, he had met this seemingly honest young scholar. It was this scholar who caused many things in Jingdo in the future, such as his father-in-law being forced to tragically resign. This person was originally on good terms with Guo Baoquan, the son of Guo Yu, the Minister of Rights. He was on the crown prince's side through and through. Later on, he became an imperial censor in the imperial censorate and began to advise the second prince. Later on, he switched sides with the crown prince. After switching sides twice, people finally realized that he was on the eldest princess's side. He was just following the eldest princess's wishes. However, during the Jingdo Rebellion, it was this imperial censor of the left who led a group of imperial censors to run around naked. He gambled that the crown prince, Li Chengxian, could not bear to kill people and forcefully delayed the rebel army's entry into the capital for a night. This gave Fan Xian the opportunity to launch a surprise attack on the royal palace, control the center, and reverse the situation in one move. Only now did people truly see clearly that He Zongwei was no one's man. He was only the emperor's man. He had always been. The emperor had returned to the capital, and He Zongwei had been rewarded for his great service. He climbed up like a rocket. Although he only held his original position in the imperial censorate, he had the right to discuss matters in the Hall of Governmental Affairs. Anyone with a discerning eye knew that imperial censor, he might one day take over the position of the already old Shu the scholar. His future was bright and immeasurable. During the turmoil in Jingdo, He Zongwei had helped Fan Xian greatly. Even though he was now in a high position of power, each time he ran into Fan Xian in court or outside, he was still incomparably respectful. There was nothing to nitpick about, and appeared exceptionally humble. However, Fan Xian disliked this person. Perhaps it was because he had seen this person's burning desire for power a long time ago. Perhaps it was because he disliked this kind of person who sold others to climb up. They had even hidden from the Overwatch Council's secret agents Fan Xian had stationed here to protect the Wang family. Wang Qinian had this ability. Fan Xian never doubted this. From Chen Pingping's mouth, he learned the good news that Wang Qinian was alive. At the same time, he learned that Wang Qinian had left. He knew why Chen Pingping had sent Wang Qinian away. Wang Qinian had escaped from Dong Mountain. Regardless of whether it was in terms of Qing law or council regulations, he could only die. Fan Xian would not let him die. This was a thorn between him and the emperor. Furthermore, Chen Pingping knew that Wang Qinian knew too many of Fan Xian's secrets. For Fan Xian's safety, he had to have Wang Qinian leave. For some reason, the departure of such a subordinate made Fan Xian so sad. He held a letter in his hand. Wang Qinian had passed it to him through Chen Pingping. There were very few words in the letter. The general gist was that he had abandoned the emperor and left the mountain. This was a capital offense. However, Fan Xian made him feel at ease, and did not make the grave mistake he was worried about. Fan Xian's heart was at a loss. He knew that Wang Qinian had taken the risk to come down the mountain to find him, because he was afraid that he would think the emperor was already dead, and, with a flip of his hand, embark on the path of fighting for imperial power. His hand tightened slightly, and crumpled the paper into a ball. His expression was ugly. There was no one to joke with him anymore. Su Wenmao's level was much lower than Lao Wang's. He lowered his head, and looked at Lao Wang's little courtyard. For some reason he thought of a scene from many years ago. At that time, he had still been a young man who had just entered Jingdo, and didn't know any rules. He had dazedly gone to the Qing temple, and met his wife. Stupidly, he had gone to the Overwatch Council's square building. He had seen a lifeless face, deathly white teeth and old skin on both cheeks. It was Wang Qinian. At that time, Wang Qinian was an official whose spirit had already been worn down by paperwork. He spent all day in the Overwatch Council waiting for the day of his retirement. However, he was the first person Fan Xian had met. From then on, his life changed. He returned to the nervousness and interest of his life as a great bandit. Fan Xian and Wang Qinian's meeting was a kind of fate. It was this kind of coincidental encounter that made Fan Xian trust him incomparably, and Wang Qinian incomparably loyal to him. He changed Wang Qinian's life. Wang Qinian knew all of his secrets, including the chest, the key, and his thoughts. Wang Qinian was not only his subordinate, but also his good friend. He was the person he talked to and confided in. Such a role could not be replaced by anyone. It was such a role that, for Fan Xian's own safety and future, he had no choice but to disappear without a trace. Fan Xian's face was slightly pale. As for Fan Xian's reward, there was a small problem. According to news from the palace, the emperor had been prepared to directly bestow Fan Xian the title of Junwang. However, he had been fearfully blocked by the scholars Hu and Shu. A different surname being made a king had never happened before. No wonder the officials were terrified by the emperor's initial edict. Although everyone knew that Fan Xian was the emperor's illegitimate child, his surname was after all Fan. If he suddenly became a king, the Qing kingdom would be laughed at by the world. Fan Xian was also shocked. Becoming a king, and the king of Donbua at that. What was this? Fortunately, this edict had been blocked. He was incomparably grateful to the scholars Hu and Shu. First-ranked Duke of Donbua was already the limit for non-royal descendants. As for the land and gold, Fan Xian did not care much about it. He was currently one of the wealthiest people in the world. Perhaps the emperor also knew that other rewards would not satisfy Fan Xian, which was why he had made the absurd suggestion of making him a king at the beginning. He could not be made a king. Unexpectedly, the palace finally sent down an edict to bestow the name Fan Shunning on Fan Xian's daughter, Fan Xiaohua, and make her a princess. Preposterous. There were countless preposterous things in the world, but none was more preposterous than this. The daughter of a minister was actually conferred the title of a princess, and this daughter was not even born of the first wife. Yet she insisted on using Lin Wuner's title as a descendant. It was too absurd. No one would have thought that the emperor would have such a stubborn and mischievous side. Of course, in Fan Xian's opinion, the most absurd thing was the name the emperor had given the girl Shunning. Did you think you were playing around? No matter how absurd this edict was, a glimmer of warmth still rose in Fan Xian's heart. He felt the emperor's intentions. The next day, he entered the palace to see the emperor and give thanks. Along the way, he asked if Shunning's name could be changed. Without waiting for him to open his mouth, the emperor smiled slightly and said, "Jiaozhou Su Maokai. I removed him from his position and let him retire. He has already returned to Chuanzhou." Hearing this, Fan Xian's heart jumped. His mouth was dry. He was so shocked he couldn't say a word. He didn't dare to say anything else. He kowtowed in thanks and silently returned to the manor. He thought deeply for a long time in the manor's study, calculating just what the emperor wanted to do, and what he knew. He knew where Su Maokai had given himself away. From Dong Mountain to Danzhou, Su Maokai had helped him resist the Jiaozhou navy, landed on the shore, and broken arrows. It was clear that he was one of his people. Before the Jiaozhou navy was trapped on Dong Mountain, Su Maokai had not sent any news to the court. Although the emperor counted all of this in his heart, he cared deeply about the heart of any official. It was clear that Su Maokai was loyal to Fan Xian and not to the court. After the matter, the emperor only needed to check Su Maokai's history these years to connect it to the once illustrious Chuanzhou navy. If this had been any other time, it would have been difficult for Su Maokai to escape death. Fortunately, Fan Xian had always displayed unwavering loyalty to the emperor, including the Dong Mountain incident. After experiencing countless tests, he had finally obtained the emperor's absolute trust. This time, he did not kill Su Maokai and did not say it explicitly. He only said he was letting him retire. This could be considered giving Fan Xian enough face. Fan Xian's heart felt a bit cold. He also felt a bit confused. Once again he sank into confusion. The next day, He did not enter the palace to ask for forgiveness, because he was not guilty. However, he occasionally couldn't help but think that the emperor was much gentler than before. If it had been the crown prince or the second prince, this matter would not have ended as easily as it did today. The gentler the emperor was to him, the more uncomfortable Fan Xian felt. In the palace, the emperor had once asked about the situation of the tyrannical Jinqi in his body. Knowing that there was no danger of his body exploding, he remained silent and did not say a word. Fan Xian could not understand what his true attitude was. Time was like snow. It scattered and gently fell, easily covering everything in the world. When northern Qi, southern Qing, and western Hu were all covered in snow, the sound of firecrackers gradually rang out. Fragrance filled the air. It was the arrival of the Spring Festival. The 8th year of the Qing calendar had finally arrived. During the time of internal chaos in the Qing kingdom, regardless of whether it was the Empress Dowager, who had been in power for a few days, or the emperor, who had returned to the capital, they all resolutely used the powerful military forces in their hands to attack in all directions. They used such an overbearing momentum to intimidate everyone in the world. In the west, Li Hongqing was following the Western Expedition Army and coldly watching the movements of the Hu people in the wind and snow. After the Hu people's power gathered the elite of the northern man, they had become more and more powerful. However, the snow-covered plains made everyone resist the harsh nature. No one was in the mood to fight. They had to wait until the first spring grass grew, and the Hu people's horses gained their first layer of fat, before the Hu people would once again come to Shiliang Road in the Qing kingdom to carry out the routine that had lasted for 100 years. The entertainment that had been banned in Jingdo for a month because of the Empress Dowager's death was finally lifted. Perhaps it was to show that the Qing kingdom was still singing and dancing, but the emperor continuously issued a number of benevolent edicts. Dances danced, horses galloped, firecrackers rang, red lanterns hung high, and Jingdo was a fiery red. On the first day of the new year, Fan Xian was brought to the palace by the emperor. He ate a meal and missed the important event of the Fan clan. After another 2 days, Fan Xian finally escaped and brought his entire family to a place on the outskirts of Jingdo. This place was completely different from the festive atmosphere of the new year. It was shrouded in an oppressive, sorrowful, and gloomy atmosphere. This was a new cemetery. The emperor did not allow the bodies of the people who participated in the rebellion to be taken away by wild dogs. Instead, he gathered them together and buried them in one place. He also did not restrict relatives from coming to pay their respects. This edict touched countless people. A few tombs of clearly different styles and sizes were on the hill. Fan Xian held his daughter with Lin Wen'er and Cece behind him. He stood in front of these tombs and turned his head to look at the wisps of green smoke rising from the cemetery below. He was silent. Before they came here, they had already gone to another tomb to pay their respects to the subordinates of the Overwatch Council and imperial soldiers who had died in the Jingdo Rebellion. Fan Xian did not go to the royal mausoleum, although the Empress Dowager was buried there. He came directly to this side and came to the top of this hill. Pulling back his gaze from below, he looked at these large tombs silently. The crown prince, the second prince, the empress, and the eldest princess were all buried here. No matter how benevolent the emperor had become, he would not allow these people to be buried in the royal cemetery. However, this place was facing the water and mountains. It was also a place with good feng shui. Additionally, it was far from the green smoke below, so it could be considered quiet. Putting down the joss paper and incense he had bought, Fan Xian stood in front of the 4 large tombs and bowed. He then followed Lin Wen'er to kneel in front of the eldest princess' grave and kowtowed twice. He then held little Hua, to show to the people in the grave. In order to ward off evil, he rubbed some wine between little Hua's brows. The spiciness made the little girl cry. Fan Xian raised his brows and looked at the stone tomb in front of him. He thought to himself, "My mother-in-law, please don't let little Hua be as strange as you." Seeing that Wen'er was still kneeling on the ground burning joss paper, Fan Xian did not disturb her. Instead, he walked in front of the crown prince, Li Chengqian, and the second prince's graves. Looking at the two graves, he couldn't help but quietly recite, "Even if there is a 1,000-year iron threshold, in the end, it is still a dirt bun." There were 4 large and hard dirt buns there. Fan Xian looked at them in a daze. His emotions were complicated. It was not until now that he realized that the blood of the Li family not only flowed with madness and perversion, it was also brimming with pride and unyieldingness. He looked at Li Chengqian and the second prince's graves and sighed in his heart. The Li brothers were truly unyielding, much stronger than him. No one knew better than Fan Xian how terrifying death was. However, these 2 Li brothers had died so cleanly and with such pride. They used this kind of death to shatter the emperor's hard outer shell. In this he was not as good as them. Fan Xian lowered his head and thought to himself. Holding De Bao's hand behind him, he walked back to the eldest princess's grave. Looking at Wan'er's tearful eyes, Fan Xian was silent for a moment. He then pitifully crouched down and wiped the corners of her eyes. De Bao also followed his actions and crouched down, looking at the large grave innocently. Although he didn't know that the most beautiful woman in the Qing kingdom inside the grave had gradually become white bones, he still felt a glimmer of coldness. "The princess mother is inside and not coming out?" De Bao asked curiously. "Yes," Fan Xian said with a forced smile. "Xiao Xian, I still feel, why would the princess mother kill Bao? She was so beautiful." Lin De Bao furrowed his brows and asked in a very serious voice. Fan Xian's heart thumped. Realizing that Wan'er did not hear this, he relaxed slightly. A person called Li Yunrui killed Bao. This was what Fan Xian had been trying to tell De Bao. Unexpectedly, it couldn't even fool an idiot. He felt a bit bitter in his heart. However, he was unable to explain to De Bao whether a person was beautiful or not was often not the same as what she did. For example, his princess mother and his. Xiao Xian. The great prince suddenly appeared behind Fan Xian and the others. The third prince went forward and respectfully bowed to Fan Xian. He then affectionately stood by De Bao's side. Fan Xian furrowed his brows and looked at the great prince. "Why have you also come?" After all, the identities of the people buried in the 4 mud buns were too special. Coming to pay respects was too sensitive. The great prince glanced at him with a cold expression and said, "The people buried here are also my brothers." Fan Xian was speechless and said with slight worry, "I'm just afraid that the emperor will not be happy." The great prince was suddenly silent. A moment later he quietly said, "Father has also come." Fan Xian was startled and abruptly stood up. Turning his head, he gazed toward a certain spot on the hill. He saw that in the chilly winter forest, there was a figure moving about. A middle-aged man wearing bright yellow clothing was looking at the 4 large graves on this side. Although there were countless guards in front and behind him, he looked very lonely. That night, Fan Xian held a banquet in the manor. Yesterday, his father had already resigned and left for Danzhou. Lady Lu had also followed. Presently, only Fan Xian and his family were left in the Fan Manor. It appeared particularly lonely. The banquet Fan Xian held was hot pot. He drank wuliangya produced by the palace treasury. The guests he had invited were the great prince and third prince. When the hot pot was placed in front of him, Fan Xian seemed to finally understand why he could not forget it since Jiangnan. His heart was empty, and he could not find a clue to his thirst. It was spicy. After eating a mouthful of hot pot, it was so spicy that his head was covered in sweat. It was good. He drank a mouthful of strong wine. It was so painful that his throat was dry. The remaining wine in the pot was gone. The great prince was drunk and lying on the table. No one knew what he was talking about. The third prince was also given 2 cups by Fan Xian. He went to the guest room and lay down drunk. There was only Fan Xian left. Under the cold moon of the winter night, his hand held the wine cup. His eyes were blurry. The spiciness was unbearable, and the pleasure was unbearable. It was as if tears were about to fall. She sat alone on the roof behind him, facing the bright moon and listening to Fan Xian's drunken poem. She was silent. It seemed that even the black cloth covering her eyes was thinking about who she was. Why did he feel something that he had never felt before when he listened to this song? Fishing terrace, wild gull guess for 10 years. White clouds come and go, and green mountains remain. Drink to your heart's content. He owed Zhou for his talents, violated Lu Ruan's prohibition on drinking, and repaid Li Du's poetry debt. Su Zhai laughed at me, and I laughed at Su Zhai. Returning in the evening, the wild apes on West Lake Mountain mourned. 20 years, how many romantic freaks, flowers blooming and withering? On the cloud-gazing platform, the sleeves of the stars to pacify the country broke the Yinhua bewitching stronghold. Su Zhai laughed at me, and I laughed at Su Zhai. It was for the joy in front of the palace. Chapter 594. The battle for third place is too urgent. I'm only a few dozen votes away, and I can be overtaken at any time. If anyone still has a monthly vote, please vote. Just at the VIP monthly voting section of the book page. Please. Today is the last day of August, and also the last chapter of Pleasure Before the Palace. The end of this volume, just like the chapter on Ancient Path, is the chapter I'm most satisfied with. After that, it will be the beginning of the next volume, and the beginning of the last volume. This month is the month after the new book month. I've written the most, and everyone can see that it's the most exhausting month I've written. At the same time, I think it's the best month I've written. Just like what Mo Wu said in his book, the things you write must be worthy of yourself and everyone else. For the story of the year of Qingyu, I can be worthy of myself, and I think I can be worthy of all the readers who have subscribed and voted for it. This is the reason why I sincerely ask for monthly votes. Chapter 595. End of Volume 6. Summary in some words. Please read it for free. First, I want to express my gratitude to everyone for using the votes in your hands to kick me to third place. This is the most intense month since the start of the new book month. I've been in the top 3 before, but not as nervous and excited as I was yesterday. Perhaps only when people start to want something will they start to value a certain goal. I let out a long sigh. I reached my goal last month completely because of everyone's support. I'm really grateful. 7,949 votes. That was a record in the year of Qingyu. It was doubled in May, but it was still only around 8,000 votes. It was really difficult for me to imagine that I would be able to get so many votes. Perhaps it was because I was getting votes more frequently and being more shameless. Perhaps my frequent canvassing for votes would make some of my dear readers feel a little unhappy. I apologize in advance, but it can't be helped. In Jianghu, people can't help themselves. Just like the little girl on the bridge, she stretched out her hand out of habit. Handsome, buy your girlfriend a flower. Everyone is handsome, so I have to reach out my hand for votes. I have to admit, the ranking on the monthly votes is related to the prize money, but not only is it related to the prize money, there is also a sense of satisfaction and vanity from being recognized. And I am indeed very vain. This is not an excuse. Speed and passion are like this. A fat man can only burn fat, but not the universe. I can only say my thanks again, and promise to write more seriously in the future. After saying my thanks, I got to the main topic of the day. After solving the third volume, I have to write an epilogue for every volume. It can be considered a summary, and chat with everyone about the content of the volume. This was announced to everyone the day before yesterday, so please take some time to read it. Volume 6 is the longest volume, with a total of almost 1 million words. It can really be described as vast and endless, long-winded, like the eldest princess foot-binding. It was clear that the 6th volume was the most important volume of the Qingyu year, because in this volume, all the traps buried in the previous volumes had been stripped of their disguises, and all the power they had accumulated exploded. The people hidden in the dark had all jumped to the front of the stage, and those who were alive or playing minor roles had all died. In the first chapter, before Wu Zhou's son-in-law, when I finished the 2 songs, I was very excited. I wanted to shout, "Something big is going to happen." There were at least tens of thousands of people who had died in this scroll. If only those with names were counted, there were still quite a few. It was truly a tragic scene. Ever since I started writing, I had never written about so many deaths. In the Vermilion Bird Chronicles, Yi Tianqing's massacre of the heavenly soldiers always gave people the impression that he was waving light dots around. Of course, that didn't count. Many people had died, and we had to arrange different ways of death for them. We had to make sure that their deaths matched their personalities. It was a very painful thing, and I was very tired from writing. Particularly for the commoners who had died unjustly, they could not be easily explained away. Dead people also needed to be respected, particularly people like Kuhi and the eldest princess. As for the ingenuity and pitfalls, it was not tiring to fill them in, because this was the content that had already been prepared when the first volume of the Qingyu year began. Speaking up to this point, I would like to explain a little. This is because a small number of readers think that the emperor transforming into a grandmaster is a cheat, and that the transformation is too sudden. There are even more unkind comments that say that I am too lazy to write an outline. So I write whatever I want, and when I see that things can't be solved, I let the emperor transform into a human. I scratched my head. No, I really did write an outline, and I wrote a detailed outline. Haha. Perhaps there was a problem with my ability, but there was no problem with my attitude in writing the Qingyu year. I carefully thought through each step before I continued. It was just like the emperor's true nature, the arrangements of these few years, and even a dozen years. In reality, before the riddle was revealed at Dong Mountain, even as early as half a year ago, there were already readers who had guessed that the emperor was a great grandmaster. They had basically caught all of the threads I had hidden. It was a happy thing for a storyteller to hide something in the story, and then be caught by a friend who was reading the book. For example, the Qing emperor's discovery of Lin Wanner's movements in the Qing temple before Gongdian. For example, after a night of poetry, Wu Zhu and Fan Xian entered the palace. For example, the emperor's strange behavior in the royal study. For example, the source of his powerful confidence. For example, the play in the Hanging Temple. For example, how he knew of the eldest princess and the crown prince's secret, and thus proved Fan Xian and Pingping's evil plan. I was very satisfied that, regardless of whether it was the Qing emperor or Yi Luyan, these two biggest traps, they had already pointed out what they were hiding the first time they appeared. The Qing emperor's first appearance was in the Qing temple. Yi Luyan's first appearance was in Danzhou, and he saw Wu Zhu. The world was so big. Why did he go to Danzhou? It had been a long time since I had been narcissistic. Today I would be a little narcissistic. I was very satisfied with these two threads leading to the end. As for the Qing emperor's identity as a great grandmaster, the deepest hidden thread was mentioned in Chen Pingping and Fan Jian's last conversation. During the northern expedition, the Qing emperor was heavily injured. His entire body was stiff and unable to move. I have mentioned this story many times before. The more important ones were in Volume 4, Chapter 28, and Volume 5, Chapter 50, Autumn Forest Whispers. At the time, Chen Pingping faintly said to Fan Xian, "At the time, the emperor was injured. His body was as hard as a block of wood. He could not move at all. As for the matters of wiping his body and urinating and defecating, there had to be a careful woman left to do it." Later, on a stormy night, the eldest princess also mentioned her brother's heavy injury. His entire body was stiff. What did that look like? It was actually the exact same situation after Fan Xian's tyrannical Jinqi reached its peak and exploded. During that northern expedition, the emperor, who had already trained his tyrannical Jinqi to the peak, fought a bloody battle and spat out Jinqi wildly. Just like the battle between Fan Xian and the shadow, he finally exploded. Furthermore, he exploded even more fiercely than Fan Xian. He did not have two circulations like Fan Xian or Fan Xian's monstrously thick meridians. His luck was even worse than Fan Xian's. In the barren mountains and unruly rivers, there was no doctor, no medicine, no waste, and no begonia. There was only Chen Pingping and Lady Ning. Thus, the Qing emperor's meridians were shattered. He could not move at all. He bled internally and almost died. However, in the end he survived. Without great perseverance and great luck, one could not reach the realm of a great grandmaster. When it came to perseverance, without question, the Qing kingdom's mighty emperor fully deserved to be number one. No one could compare to him. As for the story of that northern expedition, how the emperor entered the realm of a great grandmaster, and the effect this experience had on him, There will be a more detailed description in the next volume, Emperor of the Dynasty. I will not continue here. Since we are talking about the Qing Emperor, I will say a few more words. Perhaps from the beginning, I knew what kind of ruthless character I was writing about, so I have always secretly invested my feelings in him. Even now, I still think this emperor is very remarkable. When a person is cold-blooded and heartless, or a bastard, you have to admit that this is another form of greatness. Furthermore, we always stand in Fan Xian's, or Yi Qingmei's point of view to consider problems. Sometimes, perhaps we forget that the Qing emperor also made many sacrifices for the sake of a goal. In other words, he was also an idealist. Among the people of that generation, there were 3 idealists. One was Yi Qingmei, the other was the emperor, and the son of the 2 of them was a true realist. He was a little merciful, a little lenient, a little scheming, a small citizen, a villager, and a cynic. Of course, this is what I like about Fan Xian. After all, he is still like a person, while his parents are not like people anymore. Book friends often say that there are 2 lines in the Qingyu years, one in the light and one in the dark. One is about Fan Xian, and one is about Yi Qingmei. In reality, when I write, there are basically 3 lines. There is still one line that I have always kept in mind, and that is the emperor. From this, it can be seen how much I value and admire this person. Admiration does not mean that I like him. My sisters, please understand this and promise me. When a woman reaches the pinnacle, she is Yi Qingmei. When a man reaches the pinnacle, he is the Qing emperor. These are just some of my personal thoughts. They are not necessarily correct. Furthermore, I have always thought that when things are too extreme, they are always very cruel to others and to oneself. Fan Xian is so good, so mediocre. So right now he is so troublesome and difficult to endure. Things like feelings are always obtained through interaction. There are no innate feelings. For example, his feelings for Fan Jian, and his feelings for Chen Pingping. Just as Gidge Pig said, in front of the cave in Shi Mountain in northern Qi, Fan Xian mainly thought of Yi Qingmei as a distant and unreachable kindred, a friend connected by blood and heart, close but unfamiliar. However, her legacy lived on. Every breath of air carried the scent of that woman. Everyone beside him would retell the story of the past. Gradually, Fan Xian finally determined his own nature. He was already in the Qing kingdom. He was a part of this world. Yi Qingmei was his mother. This was the process of brainwashing. Fan Xian kept his distance from the emperor, but he had to admit that the emperor treated him well. Knowing favors was a good moral character. He could only blame himself, an orphan, for having such a pair of parents after his rebirth. But Fan Xian had also improved, a great improvement. It was an improvement in his worldview. This was a very remarkable thing. In terms of age, he was already a middle-aged man. Yet he was still able to continuously revise his ideals. Particularly, his ideals had been washed away by death, and appeared incomparably stubborn and ruthless. In the meadow he stood up. In life he should also stand up. He should gradually understand that life will always end. Some existences in life may be more important than life itself. Many people died in this volume. It is truly a sad thing. But I won't write anything to mourn those pitiful people, because it is already written in the book. A few days ago, I saw a blog. The girl who wrote the blog, it should be a girl, right? Wrote a long review after Dong Mountain. At the time I remembered it. Later, I saw people transfer it in the book review section. Thank you very much. In a moment, I will move it to the public area for everyone to take a look. I sighed again. Writing this volume was very tiring, particularly the last dozens of chapters. It was truly beyond my expectations that I had written so many words in August. Sometimes, I found that some sour words were right. After writing for a long time, it was no longer me who controlled the story, but the story that controlled me. The people in the story had their own thoughts, and were not controlled by me at all. Then, they had the desire to act and speak, and they used my hand to beat it out. That is why I wrote so quickly last month. It was because of this that I couldn't resist writing one paragraph after another. Perhaps it was because I had feelings for the characters in the story. Fan Xian had stayed in that world for a long time, so he had love. I had written about this world for a long time, so I also had love. Regardless of whether it was Vermilion Bird Story or Qing Yunyan, the latter parts were better written than the former. For the work of the 7th volume, I had taken the time these 2 days to read Qing Yunyan in detail from beginning to end, and once again confirmed this point. It wasn't because I didn't put in effort at the beginning. It was because the characters at the beginning were all unfamiliar and distant to me. After writing 2 million words, I was already very familiar with these people's faces. Like the little girl selling noodles downstairs, I was happy and naturally familiar with them. The level of the later parts was better, but the level of the words did not improve. Especially after rereading, I found many wordy places, sticky places, and redundant words. This was a very shameful thing. My words were sloppy, but they were never clean. The cleanest words in Qing Yunyan still appeared in the chapter where Fan Xian killed the assassin when he was 12. The problem was that I had written that chapter for 4 whole hours, and the number of words was still very small. For the time being, I can't solve the problems with the words. Please forgive me. However, I still like the chapter names I chose. Every afternoon after writing a few thousand words, I would worry about what to name it. Basically, it was all nonsense, but sometimes it was quite interesting. In the last 10 or so chapters, many readers pointed out that there were many famous foreign names. Some friends even asked in the book review section if I had been studying the history of foreign literature. Actually, what you said was right. The process of writing Vermilion Bird Story was a learning process. Until the end, I was still full of energy, and my mind was full. Writing Qing Yunyan was a digging process. My mind was almost empty, so I decided to read. I wanted to read the world's famous books to fill my empty mind. Unfortunately, I still didn't manage to read a single book. I've been reading it all the way until the end of his draft. Of course, the draft is more than just the words posted now. If I remember correctly, Chaotic Clouds should have been written more than half a year ago. In the end, it took so long for it to be posted. Xiao Cui put in a lot of effort. She put in so much effort that it took her a lot of effort to write. It was truly admirable. I need to read it carefully. After talking about the 6th volume and recommending books, I will talk about the 7th volume, which is the final volume of the Qing dynasty. This volume is very troublesome, very troublesome. I will try to finish it before the end of the year and draw a satisfactory full stop. I don't need to worry about a bad ending, because cats care about their tails the most. Cat owners all know this. The 7th volume, Emperor of the Qing dynasty, has 3 periods. Of course, it is still the traditional way. It is impossible to suddenly and inexplicably start. However, there are some things that started in the 8th year of the Qing calendar that I cannot talk about specifically. Everyone, please follow me as I unfold it. The joy in front of the palace is not joyous. As for Emperor of the Qing dynasty, perhaps it looks a bit depressed, but I want to twist it into a bright youth. Everyone, look at how happy I am writing this summary. You will know what kind of emotions I am cultivating. However, because the 7th volume is too troublesome, I need time to organize my thoughts and outline. I ask for a day off from everyone so that my mind, which was empty because of the end of the 6th volume, can be taught again. Today, other than this summary, there is no main text. I ask for everyone's understanding. However, I have written over 5,000 words in the summary. I really am as long-winded as ever. It is very strange that I did not update on the first day of the month, but I cannot help but urge everyone to vote for me. It is said that it is easy to go from frugality to extravagance, but difficult to go from extravagance to frugality. It is difficult to go from extravagance to frugality. It is difficult to go from the vast ocean to the water. Apart from Mount Wu, it is not clouds. Taking a flower bush, I am lazy to look back. Half fate, the monthly vote in half fate. I raise my cup to invite the bright moon. I do not want to be scolded, so I quickly stop being sour. Finally, I congratulate teacher Wang Haidong for having children. Mother and daughter are safe. As a mother, her stomach was stabbed, but as a father, his feet hurt. This is a small matter. Haha, I congratulate him again. Yes, it is about the same time as Fan Xian's father. This Ming family property dispute lawsuit was truly in Jiangnan, aimed at the Jingdo royal palace. It had to be said later, the emperor's worship to the heavens to depose the crown prince, as well as the crown prince's final forced rebellion, all had an unclear connection to this lawsuit. In Jiangnan, Song Shuren's glory was limitless. However, when he returned to Jingdo, the crown prince had not been deposed and the empress dowager was furious. The old woman had only quietly said a few words, and the world's best attorney had been kneaded into an ant by the palace. His family's property had been confiscated, and he had to see the world look down on him. He set up a stall in Lotus Pond Square and struggled to survive. Fortunately, Fan Xian returned to the capital at that time and secretly sent him out of Jingdo. He also gifted him a large sum of money as a form of repayment. At the beginning of the 8th year of the Qing calendar, the Jingdo matter was settled. Fan Xian brought Song Shuren's family back and bought him a manor in the west of the city. At the same time, he gave him the identity of an official. Although the best attorney in the world could earn money, his status was not as high as an official's. Song Shuren was endlessly grateful. At the same time, he knew he had to sell his life well for Sir Fan Jr. Additionally, after experiencing the baptism of these few years, Song Shuren was no longer as arrogant as before. Instead, he appeared steady and ordinary, but he still had a powerful ability to execute laws. His present identity was an official of the 8th Bureau of the Overwatch Council's legal department. He was responsible for helping the Overwatch Council fight lawsuits. The Overwatch Council also needed to fight lawsuits? If this matter had to be told from the beginning, it would be a very long story. There were two important points. First, a few years ago, the Emperor had taken back all of the Overwatch Council's trial power and divided it between the Ministry of Justice and the Supreme Court. Thus, the Overwatch Council was now more of a public prosecutor. During these 2 years, the little Duke of the Overwatch Council seemed to have been provoked by something. After asking for the Emperor's edict, he began to purge the governance of officials. The Overwatch Council had captured countless corrupt officials in various roads, counties, and departments. If they captured a criminal official, they had to be interrogated. If they were just handed over to the Ministry of Justice and Supreme Court to interrogate, the Overwatch Council would not be satisfied. Sir Fan Jr. would also not agree. Everyone knew that officials protected each other. Since the Overwatch Council wanted to investigate the governance of officials, they would not give these civil officials a chance to band together. Thus Song Shuren, the newly promoted official of the Overwatch Council specializing in lawsuits, played a great role. One was that the Overwatch Council had found that a vice director of the Ministry of Works had colluded with the River Transport Governor's Yamen to embezzle silver from the river works. Furthermore, this silver was not from the public. Fan Xian had painstakingly saved it from his own little treasury in the Jiangnan Palace treasury. Then, through the Hangzhou conference that Lady Fan controlled, it had been transported to the River Transport Governor's Yamen. Greed had reached the head of the Overwatch Council's ancestor, so the Overwatch Council was not polite at all. They didn't care about the minister-councilor's connections in court, or the private pleading letter the River Transport Governor had sent. In one dark night, they arrested 20 related criminals and locked them up in the 7th Bureau's prison for a few days before sending them to the Supreme Court. The second lawsuit was a bit of a headache. The Imperial Censorate had found that a certain official of the 4th Bureau of the Overwatch Council stationed in Nanzhou had secretly transferred some silver from the Honglu Temple. When this official returned to the capital to report on his work, the problem was discovered. Using the words of this 4th Bureau official, at the time, there was not enough funds. In order to develop spies in Nanzhou, they had no choice but to use public funds. However, no one knew exactly how much he had used and whether or not he had intercepted it. The inside of the Overwatch Council knew that this colleague had certainly received benefits. It was just that he was a spy in a foreign country. Even though Commissioner Fan had consecutively increased the Overwatch Council's monthly salary 3 times, they were still nervous. No one was a saint. Has the case been prepared? Song Shuren glanced at the assistant beside him. His name was Chun Buchang. He was the famous person who had fought against Song Shuren in Jiangnan. Unexpectedly, in the end, he had also been half invited and half tied back to Jingdo by Song Shuren. The newly established legal department of the 8th Bureau was all famous litigation masters from various places. Every time he thought of this, Song Shuren, whose heart was as calm as still water, couldn't help but smile bitterly. Sir Fan Jr.'s way of doing things was still as arrogant as ever. It was clear that the Emperor had the Imperial Censorate check and balanced the Overwatch Council. Yet you still brazenly went against them, and did it so happily. Chen Buchang made a sound of acknowledgement and stood up. As an official of the First Bureau of the Overwatch Council, Mu Tai was listening at the side in the Supreme Court. He wanted to see how the Vice-Chancellor of the Ministry of Works was treated, and to ensure that the official of the 4th Bureau of the Overwatch Council would not suffer too much. With Sir Fan Jr. doing things like this, it was no wonder the Imperial Censorate could never win the case against his family. After all, no matter how much Sir He Zongwei was favored by the Emperor, or how much effort he put in, he could not stop Sir Fan Jr. from becoming hostile at any moment. If Sir Fan Jr. truly became hostile, He Zongwei would not be able to withstand it. Given his personality, even if the Emperor spoke, it would probably be useless. Everyone knew how much the Emperor valued or favored him. Why didn't the commissioner come to watch the show today? Chen Buchang swallowed and asked as he walked. During this year, Fan Xian's greatest interest seemed to be acting as a backer for his subordinates, listening to the Supreme Court's trials, and watching the Imperial Censorate's ashen faces. Logically speaking, it was fine to send an official of Mu Tai's level to listen. Even Yin Bingyan couldn't be bothered to come. Yet he kept coming. This little duke sat with his legs crossed in the Supreme Court Yamen. All of the trial officials began to feel afraid. No one dared to use torture on an Overwatch Council official. This was the effect he wanted. The Emperor has sent him out. Song Shuren only vaguely knew some inside information. He didn't say anything more. Rubbing his wrist, he glanced at the Imperial Censorate and Ministry of Justice officials in the hall. His face darkened. With a cold huff, he began to fight. Heading west from Jingdo, going around the verdant Song Mountain, crossing a number of clear rivers, and after a dozen more days, entering an area where hundreds of li of military land was being cultivated. This was one of the Qing Kingdom's 7 main roads, Shiliang Road. This road was the poorest place in the Qing Kingdom, but it was also the place with the strangest scenery. Most of the land along this road had been repeatedly fought over by the Central Plain and the Hu people over hundreds of years. Until the Wei Kingdom weakened, the Qing Kingdom and its predecessor, the vassal state, began to rise in secret. This country had not yet advanced into the heart of the land when they began to demand 1,000 years of blood debt and land from the Hu people. After fighting for many years and many people died, this piece of land was finally firmly controlled by the Qing Kingdom. At the same time, they built a number of new cities on it and moved in many people. However, it was after all a newly prosperous land. Other than farming, commerce was not developed. There were also no valuable products. It was only in recent years that the fleeing of the people who moved in had improved slightly. There were only flat and rarely tended fields, endless lines on the horizon, and the protruding mounds at the edge of the line. The barren desert in the distance looked desolate. The sun here set later than anywhere else in the land. The blood-red dusk enveloped the vast land and reflected a majestic city. It was completely piled up from earth and stone. It suddenly appeared at the edge of the land, flaunting the Qing Kingdom's powerful national and military power, and intimidating the people on the grasslands further west of the majestic city. This was Dingzhou, an important city on the western frontier. The road from Jingdo to Dingzhou was maintained very well. It could accommodate 8 horses traveling side by side. Back then, who knew how much manpower and wealth had been expended? However, it ensured the eternal peace of the Qing Kingdom's west and firmly controlled this large piece of land. No matter how one looked at it, it was worth it. A group of carriages sped toward Dingzhou on this road. It seemed that they wanted to enter Dingzhou before the sun set. However, looking at the mountain in front of them ran the horse to death. particularly on this piece of flat land. Dingzhou seemed to be in front of them, but was far away on the horizon. It looked like they would not be able to enter the city before the city gates closed. About 20 li from Dingzhou was a courier station. This courier station was not a military courier station. It was not under the jurisdiction of the Dingzhou army. Rather, it was a courier station managed by the Ministry of Works. Thus, it appeared a bit run-down and old. 7 or 8 men were yawning under the light of the setting sun. They had already eaten dinner and were preparing to gamble later. The sky gradually darkened. A strange smile suddenly appeared on the men's faces. They moved closer to the rear courtyard and listened to the sounds coming from inside. They covered their mouths and laughed, thinking that the person inside was too impatient. In a stone room in the backyard, the only official of the relay station was hugging a woman's snow-white thighs. His hands were pressed against her soft breasts, and he was moaning non-stop. His body was covered in sweat, and the room was filled with the smell of lust. Dingzhou was far away and did not have much entertainment. Night came too late. Thus, each time the sun set, he would seize the moment and carry out this only form of entertainment. The woman beneath him was a prostitute he had brought from Dingzhou. Although the prostitutes who were willing to leave the city were all average in appearance, he liked this woman's charm and the soft flesh on her body. Holding the slippery courier in his hand, he was incomparably happy. He felt that the woman beneath him seemed to be made of cotton candy, particularly her eyes, which were sweeter and more greasy than the well water in Dingzhou. The 3 liang of silver he earned a month was truly worth it. Just as he was enjoying himself, the door to the room was suddenly pushed open. The courier didn't even turn his head as he cursed. If you want to listen, then listen. If you want to see, then look. F***ck, why didn't you tell me to be careful? How dare you barge into the door? Be careful not to make me sick on horseback. The prostitute beneath him also giggled. She was not at all afraid of being seen. Suddenly, the courier felt that something was strange because there was no sound behind him for a long time. He unconsciously turned his head and saw it was a stranger. Startled, he quickly jumped up from the kong and fastened his pants. He did not forget to pull over the black quilt and cover the prostitute's white lower body on the kong. The courier wanted to let loose a torrent of curses, but seeing this stranger's expensive attire, he was probably someone he couldn't afford to offend or an official. His mouth became dry and he became afraid. In a trembling voice he said, "Who are you?" Fan Xian sat in the only chair in the courier station and looked at the large group of people kneeling in front of him. Furrowing his brows, he said, "I told you to get up, so get up quickly." He had come to Dingzhou on the emperor's edict to reward the army. He said it was to reward the army, but the secret edict he had received in the royal study had some other content. During these 2 years, the Hu people in the West seemed to have taken some stimulant or tranquilizer. They changed their romantic battle tactics of the past and began to attack Dingzhou in an organized fashion. Furthermore, their battle tactics had become very cunning. Although the Yi family still managed Dingzhou's military affairs, Yi Zhong was in charge of the Bureau of Military Affairs. He had to manage all the armies under heaven, so he could not personally keep watch. Additionally, the Hu people's attacks were too fierce. In the first year, the situation in Dingzhou was very dangerous. Fortunately, the emperor personally moved the soldiers from the various roads to take turns to provide support. Only then did the situation stabilize. The emperor and Fan Xian had long seen that there were problems, but without first-hand information, no one knew what was happening within the Hu people. The situation could not continue like this. If Shihu continued to develop like this, it would probably become a great threat to the Qin kingdom. Thus Fan Xian had made this trip. He had to listen to the personal reports from the generals in Dingzhou and understand the situation. Furthermore, Fan Xian knew that the emperor had personally moved the 5 roads to the west with the intention of using the Hu people's knives to sharpen the Qin kingdom's swords. The Hu people's attack just happened to give the Qin kingdom a chance to train its military power and prepare for the war to unify the world in the future. Since he couldn't make it to Dingzhou, he could only rest for the night in this dilapidated relay station. Unexpectedly, no one came to welcome him when he entered. 7 or 8 men were eavesdropping like children. Fan Xian was curious and pushed open the door to enter. Unexpectedly, he saw a live erotic scene. The deputy and the 7 or 8 men knelt on the ground and repeatedly kowtowed. The officials who had come with Fan Xian knew his personality and had long pretended to see it. They each prepared to rest for the night. Fan Xian looked at the deputy and laughingly scolded. "The sun hasn't even set, and you're already doing it. If you have the guts, then don't be afraid." The deputy's face fell. He knew he was about to be killed. The man in front of him was the second most important person in the world, the commissioner of the Overwatch Council. He was a high and lofty figure. He was someone he didn't even have the right to see. Fan Xian asked with confusion, "What are you afraid of?" "Sir abhors evil and hates corrupt officials the most." The deputy was so scared he was about to cry. Paralyzed on the ground, he spoke of the people's impression of Fan Xian. Fan Xian rubbed the back of his head in confusion. He thought to himself that he was already the father of 2 children. Why was it that in the hearts of the people, he seemed more and more like an otherworldly saint or demon? Chapter 597. The sky was still beginning to brighten when the group of people from Jingdo rose and washed up. This time, Fan Xian had brought all of the council's people. Other than Mu Feng, who was now in charge of the Qinian unit's matters, the rest of the people were made up of members of the 2nd and 6th bureaus. The semi-military management of the Overwatch Council made these people's auras steady and taciturn. There was only the sound of water and the creaking of the door opening, but there was no conversation. It was nearly 20 li from the courier station to Dingzhou. Speeding along the 8-horse-wide road, it didn't take much time. Furthermore, they didn't need to cherish the horses. When this group of people arrived at the east gate of Dingzhou, the sun had not risen very high. There was a glimmer of coldness in the warmth. However, the vegetable farmers lining up to enter the city, as well as the merchant groups from the Central Plains, had already formed a long line. Autumn had not yet deepened in Jingdo, but the soldiers of the large city on the border had already begun to put on armor padded with layers of cotton. Fan Xian glanced at them inconspicuously and then indicated for Mu Feng to prepare the documents for customs. From the beginning of his trip to Dingzhou, Fan Xian had not prepared to reveal the imperial envoy's honor guard. Of course, there were only a dozen people. Even if he wanted to, he couldn't. This group of people disguised themselves as Jiangnan merchants. In their hands, they held travel passes and tea contracts issued by the Ministry of Revenue and the Palace Treasury Transport Company. The reason they had to disguise themselves like this was not because the court had any suspicions about the inside of Dingzhou. Rather, it was because Fan Xian wanted to meet someone in private. In order to ensure that person's safety, it was best not to go through the court's channels and meet in private. After all, the Hu people had suddenly become enlightened. The emperor and Fan Xian both suspected that there was a capable person in charge in Shihu. Who knew if there were spies planted by the Hu people in the military and political manners of Dingzhou? The soldiers at the east gate did their inspection work very meticulously. Fan Xian did not line up. He stood to the side of the line and watched with cold eyes. He quietly nodded his head. The Yi family had operated on the western frontier for decades, yet they had not slacked off at all. No wonder the emperor appreciated them so much. The deputy at the courier station wiped the cold sweat from his forehead and followed behind Fan Xian. His heart was pounding. He had also changed into merchant clothing. His face had been tampered with by the Overwatch Council officials, making him appear even more wretched. However, he didn't understand why the noble in front of him would bring him into the city, and why he had to dress like this. The line quickly reached Fan Xian's group. Fan Xian noticed that although the Dingzhou soldiers were strict in their inspection, they did not take the opportunity to collect any benefits. Furthermore, they did not purposely make things difficult for the merchants and farmers from all over. Their speed was very fast. Mu Feng handed over the customs documents, travel passes, and tea deeds that he had prepared. The official stilled slightly and furrowed his brows. He seemed to find something strange. Fan Xian watched from the side with narrowed eyes. He didn't know what had gone wrong, but he didn't panic. In any case, in the afternoon, he was going to the governor's manor in Shiliang Road to reveal his identity. There shouldn't be any misunderstandings between the two sides. The official's surprise was not because there was something wrong with the documents. Rather, it was because they were too beautiful, particularly the seals and signatures. They were all from the heads of the yamens. Thus, it meant that the identities of this group of merchants were very important. Otherwise, why would the old officials in court personally inspect these documents? Fan Xian and his group had not expected that they would attract other people's attention. It was very simple for the Overwatch Council to make these documents. However, the Imperial Censorate had been keeping an eye on them recently, so they had simply gone to the various yamens to find the real thing. However, if it was too real, it would be too eye-catching. If it was still Wang Qinian responsible for all the details around Fan Xian, presumably he would not make such a mistake. The official glared coldly at Mu Feng, and then unconsciously glanced at Fan Xian. He understood that this noble and beautiful young man was the true leader of this group of merchants. Fan Xian did not look back at him. He was looking with interest at the Dingzhou city walls in front of him. He wondered to himself, Dingzhou is surrounded by plains or wasteland. Where did these large rocks come from? Is there yellow soil stuck between the rocks? Can this be used to build city walls? The official furrowed his brows. Unconsciously, he did not want to provoke this arrogant young man. He nodded and let them pass. After the group of merchants entered the city, he called over a subordinate and said a few words in a low voice. Fan Xian didn't know that his appreciation of the city walls would give the Dingzhou soldiers the impression that they were arrogant. He truly liked to use his own eyes to see everything in this world. After all, it was a rare second life. He always had a strong desire to explore the beauty, history, and existence around him. He had seen Shangjing's centuries-old city walls and was very familiar with Jingdou's heavily guarded city walls. It was rare for him to come to the westernmost city of the kingdom, Dingzhou, so he was curious. Furthermore, he still felt some regret in his heart. He didn't know when he would have the opportunity to see the legendary largest city in the world, Dongyi. The deputy, who had followed him into the city with a long face, gradually understood why the Duke of Danbua had brought a minor character like him into the city. The Duke was preparing to go shopping. The streets in Dingzhou were a mess with all kinds of streets intersecting. Without a local leading the way, there were many nameless places that would be impossible to find. What gave him a headache was that it seemed to be the first time the Duke of Danbua had come to such a remote place. Yet he was interested in everything. He wandered everywhere and did not find it tiring. In particular, the Hu people's weapons that had been shipped from the Hu people's tribes by Shiqi River attracted his attention for a long time. In about half a day, Fan Xian and his group had strolled through the Dingzhou trading market area. They had perfectly carried out the enthusiasm a merchant group should have. Under a mud wall, Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and looked at the distant city gate tower of Dingzhou. Lowering his voice, he asked, "Has the news been sent out?" Mu Feng carefully looked around and nodded. According to the agreement between the two sides, it has already been sent out. However, we came 2 days early. I'm afraid the other party hasn't entered the city yet. Fan Xian thought for a bit and said, "We had to come 2 days early. There's no way to block the news of me leaving the capital. Hongqing must know I'm coming. If I'm delayed by this kid, he will certainly force me to drink. How would I have time to do anything? Besides, who knows if there are Hu spies in the camp and the governor's manor?" Mu Feng glanced at the nervous deputy at the back of the group and said, "If I wasn't unfamiliar with the terrain, I really wouldn't have called for this person to lead the way. I don't know how to handle it in a bit." Fan Xian smiled and said, "It's not like it's a beheading. We just have to ensure the other party's safety. That's why we have to be so careful. As for the deputy, when we leave another day, we'll just send him 2 beauties." Although he said this, Fan Xian still felt some regret. The emperor had long forbidden the Overwatch Council from extending their tentacles too deeply into the military. Regardless of whether it was the 4th Bureau, which was in charge of the various roads, or the 2nd Bureau, which was in charge of gathering intelligence, The Overwatch Council did not have any capable people in Dingzhou. Of course, the Overwatch Council had certainly buried spies in Dingzhou. Fan Xian thought that the inside of Dingzhou was very safe, so he did not want to use these spies in case the military and political yamen were unhappy afterward. The ones who would suffer would be the lower-level officials of the Overwatch Council. The group of people stopped the carriage in a shady place and silently waited for the sun to slowly move. For lunch, they casually bought some sesame seed cakes and ate them with water. Fan Xian was no exception. Each time he moved, his actions always made the Overwatch Council subordinates feel closer. However, when the deputy saw the little duke also struggling to eat the sesame seed cake, he secretly sighed in amazement. When the shadow of the mud wall behind the carriage gradually grew longer, one of Fan Xian's subordinates returned humming a little tune. In his hands, he was still carrying the special Hu products he had bought along the way. It looked like he had been very careful along the way. At the back of the carriage, he threw these items back into the carriage and lowered his voice to say something to Fan Xian. Fan Xian raised his head and glanced at Mu Fenger. With a smile he said, "Looks like they're more anxious than us. Let's go see them." Mu Fenger thought for a bit. This shouldn't be a trap. After all, Dingzhou was the Qing Kingdom's world. No one would have the guts to set up a trap for the Overwatch Council. He nodded and went to call for the deputy. Leaving the carriages, Fan Xian, Mu Fenger, and the deputy passed through the mud wall and through the bustling streets. They walked through the curious streets like merchants coming from the mainland for the first time. After walking for an indeterminable amount of time, they finally arrived at a lamb shop. Fan Xian looked at the shop without a signboard and couldn't resist smiling. "Damn, this place is really hard to find." He patted the deputy's shoulder. "Looks like you're not bad. You even know these places." The deputy felt his entire body go limp. He thought to himself that this shoulder had been patted by the Duke. It looked like he couldn't bear to bathe for half a month. No, he only bathed once a month. It should be because he didn't look for a woman for half a month. Not looking for a woman did not seem to be worth it. Just as the deputy's thoughts were running wild, Mu Fenger had already walked into the lamb shop. Turning his body sideways, he walked through the inner door of the mud room. Covering his nose, he walked into the inner room and sat on the mat he had arranged with the person. There were 4 mats in the inner door of the shop. On the mats were small tables that provided meat, food, and wine for customers. Each mat was separated by a thin cloth, but it could not block out the sound. It was just barely enough. Fan Xian sat in the innermost area. The deputy only dared to sit half on the outside. He muttered to himself, unsure why this noble figure had to come to this unremarkable shop. Was he here to see someone? Then, he fearfully accepted the bowl of wine the Duke handed over and carefully took a sip. He then fell into a deep sleep. After eating a few pieces of lamb and drinking 2 bowls of strong wine, Fan Xian's eyes grew brighter and brighter. He glanced at the thin cloth curtain beside him and gave Mu Fenger a meaningful glance. Mu Fenger thought for a moment and then picked up the wine bowl. Standing, he lifted the curtain and went to the mat on the other side. When the curtain was raised, Fan Xian's eyes were sharp. He saw that the person was about 40 or 50 years old. However, his face was dark. After all, he was a Hu person, so he couldn't see clearly. The sun was high in the sky and gradually rising. The mud room was still quiet. It was not the right time to drink, so the shop was particularly quiet. There was only Fan Xian's group and the mysterious Hu person. No one knew what Mu Fenger said to the Hu person. After a long time, the curtain was pulled open. Mu Fenger nodded at Fan Xian to indicate that he had confirmed the other person's identity. Fan Xian turned his body and stared at the calm-looking Hu person. He found that the other person's hand was holding the wine bowl steadily. There was no change in his eyes. He slowly opened his mouth and said, "You are the foremost ace under the left virtuous king's banner. Why change your appearance and act so sneakily?" The Hu person put down his wine bowl and glanced at Fan Xian, as if he wanted to know this young man's true identity. This gaze was like lightning, piercing straight to the heart and intimidating. However, Fan Xian's expression was cold, and he did not react at all. The Hu person's brows rose slightly. It was as if he had not thought that a random official from the Qing Overwatch Council would have such unfathomable shrewdness and power. Correct, I am Hu Ge. The Hu person, who looked to be 40 or 50 years old, stared at Fan Xian's face with a hawk-like gaze. He says you are the leader, so I will talk to you. Fan Xian smiled and raised the wine bowl in his hand. There's not much I want to know. I must first confirm the princess's safety. Hu Ge, the foremost ace under the left virtuous king's banner of the Western Hu Kingdom. His reputation shook the western frontier and was deeply respected by the Hu people. His bearing was extraordinary. However, when he opened his mouth to speak the language of the Central Plains, he always felt awkward. For some reason his aura weakened a bit. Fan Xian reached into his clothes and took out a jade hook, which he handed over. After Hu Ge accepted the jade hook, his brows furrowed tightly. It was as if he had sunk into deep thought. Fan Xian did not disturb his memories. He only watched the scene quietly. The Overwatch Council had made contact with this foremost ace under the left virtuous king's banner, not because Fan Xian had exceptional abilities. Rather, he had used a troublesome method to come to them. Toward such people who came to them of their own accord, the Overwatch Council's usual way of dealing with them was not to be proactive, not to make promises, and not to take responsibility. It was not until he had indeed given the Overwatch Council some useful intelligence that the Overwatch Council began to follow up on this path. Other than Fan Xian himself, there was no one else who could follow up on this path. The reason for the relationship between Hu Ge and the Overwatch Council was Masuawa. Masuawa was still being hidden by Prince Huching, but in terms of belonging, she was in the end Fan Xian's person. This princess of a Hu tribe was a female captive, but also not a female captive. The tribe she belonged to had originally been prepared to surrender to the great prince's troops. However, before they could do so, they were exposed. The entire tribe had been completely slaughtered by the Western Hu king. The remaining tribe members could only scatter to the western regions and seek refuge with the nobility clans. Hu Ge was a warrior who had left this small tribe. Before he could reveal his identity and win glory for his tribe, he received the tragic news that his tribe had been slaughtered. After confirming Hu Ji's identity from Masuawa, Fan Xian began to strengthen his secret connection with Hu Ge. Not only did Masuawa know Hu Ge, but the two of them had been good friends when they were young. In the words of the Central Plains, they were childhood sweethearts. Fan Xian looked at his old face and muttered to himself, did the Hu people age so easily when they were exposed to the wind and sun every day? Hu Ge carefully put the jade hook into his clothes. Looking at Fan Xian, he said, I indeed want to avenge my tribe. Don't forget, I am also a Hu person. There are some things I can say, and some things I cannot say. You Qing people are too sinister and cunning. I cannot trust you. Fan Xian understood this. If he wanted Hu Ge to lead the way for the Qing army and launch a surprise attack on the Western Hu king's camp, no one in the court would believe him, let alone whether or not he would be willing. He lowered his head and thought for a moment. He then said, I don't need you to do anything. On the contrary, I can support you in doing something. I heard that the left virtuous prince's situation is not very good. If you can help him stand firm, presumably, your own power will also rise. Without waiting for the Hu tribe ace to speak, Fan Xian waved his hand crisply and said, I don't ask for much in giving you support. First, you must think of all ways to stop the great attack next spring. Even if you can't stop it, I still need your intelligence. Don't worry, the Qing people are straightforward. We won't set up an ambush. We just need to set up a formation and scare each other. You should know how to arrange this. Hu Ge furrowed his brows and said, Right now, even the left virtuous prince's words have no power, much less mine. That's your problem. Since it is cooperation, you have to show some sincerity. Fan Xian looked at him calmly. I won't mistreat you. If you want to convince those people, you can't just rely on your fists. All the nobles in the world are the same. They all like gold, silver, jewelry, and silk. Hu Ge glanced at the young official across from him. I'll give you as much as you need to bribe. Fan Xian's tone was very normal, but it revealed a powerful confidence. Furthermore, you want to revive your tribe. Presumably, you'll need a large sum of money. Actually, making a deal with me is very simple. I only need to ask you one question. Do you want to get rich? Fan Xian had once asked some people this question, such as the previous commander of the Northern Qi Brocade Guard, Sir Shinzhong. Sir Shinzhong didn't want to get rich with Fan Xian. He wanted to get rich on his own, so he died. Then, Fan Xian had asked the Northern Qi imperial uncle, Marquis Changning. This marquis was very willing to get rich with Fan Xian. Not only did his family get rich, but Wei Hua also became a high-ranking official. History had long proven that those who worked with Fan Xian were always very happy. But Hu Ge did not know the other party's true identity. He said in a cold voice, "Everyone likes gold and silver, but your words are unbelievable. So much silver. And even goods that can't be bought with silver. You want me to agree to it with just one word? Don't lie to me. Although we, the men of the prairie, are straightforward, we are not fools." Fan Xian's words did indeed sound like a lie. There were many kings' tents on the grasslands and countless nobles. These nobles were all insatiably greedy. If they wanted to fill their appetites, they would need the Qing court's strong support. How could a young official of the Overwatch Council make this decision? "I can give you a good knife produced by the palace treasury." Fan Xian didn't respond to his words. Coldly he said, "However, the quantity is limited. After all, I don't want the knife I give you to chop at the necks of the Qing people." Fan Xian didn't answer Hu Ji's question. On the contrary, Hu Ge felt even more uneasy. He stared at the young and handsome face and asked in a low and icy voice, "Who exactly are you?" Fan Xian glanced at him and said, "I am Fan Xian." With a crisp clang, Hu Ji's back slammed heavily into the dirt wall. He quickly pulled out the curved knife at his waist and aimed it at Fan Xian. The dust on the dirt wall fell down and stained the food and wine on the table. Hu Ge looked at Fan Xian with great caution. A glimmer of fear rose in his eyes. Fan Xian lowered his head and tapped his fingers on the table. He had not thought that his true identity would scare the other party to such an extent. How could this person be called the foremost ace under the left virtuous king's banner? He had no idea that the name of Commissioner Fan of the Qing Kingdom's Overwatch Council had long resounded through the world, far away from where the Hu people lived. In the hearts of the Qing people, Sir Fan Jr. was brilliant and eye-catching. In the eyes of the Qing Kingdom's enemies, this legendary young man was the #1 target to guard against. Up until now, the Hu people had never been taken advantage of by Fan Xian. However, they had been taken advantage of by Chen Pingping many times. Thus, they had endless fear and wariness toward Chen Pingping's successor. After Fan Xian admitted his identity, Hu Ji's first thought was that today's meeting was a trap. His second thought was that if this was not a trap, then this transaction would also consign the Hu people to eternal damnation. "Don't be so afraid." Fan Xian raised his head and slowly said, "Correct, I am the head of the Overwatch Council. Don't worry, I am also a good businessman. Don't forget, I control the court's palace treasury. If you don't believe in my trustworthiness, you can send someone to the central plain to investigate." "I'm not afraid." Hu Ge had already calmed down. A wolf-like wildness appeared in his eyes. Staring at Fan Xian, he enunciated each word clearly. "I just didn't think that someone of your status would lower himself to come see me and be so brave. This is the world of the Qing Kingdom. This is Dingzhou. I don't think there is anything special about my courage." Fan Xian looked at him and said, "Even a Hu person like you dares to come see me. Why wouldn't I dare to see you? You don't know how much your head is worth," Hu Ge said. "Are you not afraid that I will set a trap here and kill you?" Fan Xian glanced at him mockingly and wiped the meat oil in his hand onto the cloth curtain beside him. "This shop is filled with your people from top to bottom. If I was afraid of you setting a trap, why would I come in and sit and drink? Besides, do you think you, the so-called foremost ace under the left virtuous king's banner, can kill me?" Fan Xian furrowed his brows, as if he was looking at an insensible child. "You have a long name, but your courage is not much. A person's name was like a tree's shadow." The most powerful ace of the younger generation in the Qing Kingdom had long branded his figure in the hearts of all martial artists. Gu indeed did not have the courage to carry out such a dangerous attempt. Fan Xian stood and stared into his eyes. I don't care what you're thinking. Since my conditions are out, I want to know that person's name. This was the piece of intelligence that the Overwatch Council cared about the most in their probing contact with the other party during these 3 months. The person hidden in the Hu King's tent was hidden very deeply. Furthermore, he had brought great harm to the Qing Kingdom. The Overwatch Council and Bureau of Military Affairs had tried everything they could, but were still unable to find out who that person was. Even the two councils were not sure if there was such a terrifying military advisor in the Hu tribes, or if the two virtuous kings and the chief had suddenly been enlightened. Fan Xian did not think so. The Qing emperor also did not think so. The father and son had the same judgment. It was easy to change mountains and rivers, but it was difficult to change a person's nature. The changes in Shi Hu must have been influenced by outside forces. They were certain that that person existed. This was the most important goal of Fan Xian's trip to Dingzhou. He wanted to dig out that person. Hu Gu was the highest-ranking figure the Qing court could come into contact with among the Hu tribe. He had been urged for a long time. Hearing these words again, the expression of this Hu tribe ace changed. He knew how much help he would receive from the Qing court. Furthermore, Sua's life and death were in the hands of this young man in front of him. He didn't have much of a choice. However, you're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.